Prologue. Lawrence, Massachusetts, 1875. Sarah Brodie did her best not to get dirt on her only dress that was even close to fitting her on her way to her first day of school. She didn't really want to go to school, because her dress was much too short. Mama had been ill, and she'd not been able to make a new dress for her eldest sister, Mary. The system of hand-me-downs had been halted. Mary passed her two small dresses on to Branna, who passed her dresses on to Fiona, who passed her dresses on to Keela, who passed her dresses on to Sarah, the youngest of all the Brodie girls. Because her dress showed way too much of her legs, Sarah was embarrassed, and wished she could hide in the bushes instead of going to school, but she'd promised Mama she would go anyway. Besides, she'd been raised to be a good girl, and that meant doing what she was told, even when she didn't much want to. She stopped at the edge of the schoolyard, watching as all the friends greeted each other after a long summer apart. She'd wanted Keela to walk to school with her, but Keela had said she didn't want to be bothered by Sarah, so Mama had told her she must walk alone. She knew the way to the school as well as Keela did. Her brothers, Thomas and Raymond, were already working in the mills, because the family needed the money they could bring. Mary was in her last year of school, and she would soon marry her beau, so she hadn't wanted to even acknowledge Sarah as her sister, because Sarah was much younger than she was. A whole 10 years. So Sarah stood on the edge of the schoolyard, picking out all 4 of her sisters and trying to decide which one would be least angry if she joined her. She sighed heavily, knowing all of them would be upset and go straight to Mama as soon as they arrived home. "How come your dress is so short?" asked a little girl who stood right beside her. The little girl was dressed in a way Sarah had never seen. Why, her hair was in blonde ringlets and her dress was perfect without even a wrinkle. It wasn't a homemade dress either. No, her dress was perfect. Sarah bent her knees so they wouldn't look so long under the dress. "My mama was too sick to make a new dress for Mary." "Is your name Mary then?" the blonde girl asked her. "Oh, no, I'm Sarah, Sarah Brodie. Mary is my older sister." The girl frowned. "Then why is your dress too short if your mama didn't have time to make a new dress for Mary? That doesn't make sense." "Well, you see, Mary would give her dress to Branna." "I see. But you're not Branna, so how does that affect you?" "Branna would give her dress to Fiona." Sarah was enjoying the other girl's confusion. She had to hide a giggle. "You're not Fiona either. You're Sarah. Would Fiona give her dress to you?" "Oh, no. Fiona's much bigger than me. I couldn't wear her old dress." "No, Keela would give me her dress." "And who would Fiona give her dress to?" the girl asked, obviously still confused. "Keela, of course. Haven't you been paying attention?" "That didn't make a lick of sense, Sarah. Why did you even open your mouth to talk if you were going to talk in circles?" Sarah shrugged. "It was fun to confuse you. Why aren't you going to play? Are all of those girls you mentioned your sisters?" Sarah nodded. "They are. And none of them want me to play. I'm the baby, so they don't much like me." "Well, I'll be your friend then." "I'm Bobby." "Bobby? You can't be Bobby. That's a boy's name, and you're clearly a girl." The girl sighed. "Well, my whole name is Roberta McDaniel. I'm named after my grandfather, but my mother says that Roberta is too much of a mouthful for a little girl like me, so she calls me Bobby. Father hates it, though." "Well, I think I like it. Bobby. May I call you Bobby? Or is that a name only for your mama?" Bobby shook her head. "Oh, no. Anyone may use it. I would love it if you'd use my nickname. It's a shame about your dress, though. It makes your legs look odd with how short it is." Sarah gave a sigh of long suffering. "Oh, don't I know it? My brothers tease me mercilessly." "You mean you have all those sisters, and brothers too?" Bobby asked, surprised. "Oh, yes. There are 7 of us, God help Mama." "Why do you say that?" "Oh, that's what Mama always says when people ask how many children she has. 7, God help me." "Oh, I see. My mother almost never talks about God." We go to church every Sunday, but we don't think about God the rest of the week. Mother says people like us don't need God. Everyone needs God. My parents say rich people need God the most, because he's disappeared from their lives, and they don't know how to rely on him. Bobby said a curse word under her breath. Bobby, I won't be able to be your friend if you talk that way. Papa will simply forbid it. Please promise me you won't use that word anymore. I want you to be my lifelong friend, someone I will share all my secrets with forever. Sarah had heard her sisters talk about having lifelong friends, and she wanted one too. What better time to find one than her first day of school? Bobby nodded. I promise, I won't do it again. Sarah linked her arm through Bobby's. Oh, good. Then we shall be friends forever, and if we are old spinsters, we shall live together in a small apartment, and we will cook together and sew together. Our lives will be perfect. Everything will always be better, because we shall both have a lifelong friend. When the teacher rang the bell a moment later, she saw two little girls coming toward her with their arms linked. One of them was dressed in a hand-me-down dress over 10 years out of style, that was much too small. The other was dressed in the latest fashion and looked as if she belonged in a catalog for fashionable little girls. As lifelong friends, we simply must sit together in school, the little girl with brown hair announced to the teacher. Will that be all right? The teacher smiled at them both. I can't imagine why anyone would try to break up a lifelong friendship. Have you girls known each other long? Oh, yes, the little blonde girl answered. More than 10 minutes. She laughed as they walked past and found a desk to share at the front of the room. Lifelong friendships formed in 10 minutes. Oh, how she hoped those little girls would realize how different they were, but still remain friends. Only time would tell. Chapter 1. Sarah sat on the sofa in the apartment she shared with 3 other women. Roberta sat beside her, shaking her head. I still can't believe this happened. What are we going to do? There are over 100 women without work. And it's all my fault. Sarah sighed. Bobby, I have no idea how you've come to the conclusion this is your fault. It's not. It's Mr. Brown's fault. He's the one who stole money, and then started a fire to destroy his own property, which still makes no sense to me at all. You are not responsible for the fire or for the jobless women. I know that on one level, but I still feel like I should find everyone another job or something. Bobby's mouth turned up slightly at one corner. Or I'll find them all husbands. Should be simple. Sarah grinned, glad Bobby had found at least a little humor. My sister Keela found a husband through a matchmaker in Beckham. We should go see her. She places women with husbands out west as mail-order brides. You know, that's not a bad idea. Do you know her name? Sarah frowned for a moment. I think I have it in a letter. Let me check. She hurried off to the bedroom she shared with Bobby, coming back a moment later with a bundle of letters in her hand. Help me look. Sarah knew Bobby normally would have refused to read someone else's correspondence, but she had already read every one of Keela's letters. Keela was like an older sister to her as well, and more often than not, she had addressed the letters to Sarah and Bobby, not just to Sarah. Bobby frequently referred to Keela as her sister, because she felt like she was. I found it. Sarah said, holding up the letter in question. She went to see a woman named Elizabeth Miller, who lives on Rock Creek Road in Beckham, Massachusetts. She even included the house number, and said the 2 of us should consider going to see her if we ever needed to. Let's do it. Now. Sarah's eyes widened. Now? Like stand up and get on a train and go to Beckham to see her? Without telling anyone where we're going? Bobby grinned. Where's your sense of adventure? I need my lifelong friend to help me do this. It might be not only our way out, but maybe she has enough men for all of us. Sarah shook her head. I don't know how I keep getting talked into these things. Let's pray first though. If he doesn't want us to do it, he'll put some obstacle in our way. Bobby gripped Sarah's hand, bowing her head so her friend could pray for both of them. Father God. We come before you with a unique problem and a very unique potential solution. Please help us know if this solution is the right one, and if it's not, help us know what our solution should be. We love you, Father, and want to do your will, not ours. We pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. They sat for a moment looking at each other. Let's do it, Sarah said, jumping to her feet. It was late September, and the fire had occurred 2 days prior. It was time for them to stop licking their wounds and do something about their situation. Bobby jumped up and ran to the other bedroom, pounding on the door. Poppy opened the door, glaring at her friend. What? I'm trying to sleep here. No job, so I'll catch up on all the naps I didn't get for 6 months. We're going to Beckham. Back in a few hours. Beckham? What's in Beckham? I'll explain later. Bobby hugged Poppy. I think I may have a solution. To what? Sarah walked up behind Bobby and shook her head. Bobby's solving the world's problems again. We'll just go along with it. I'll take your turn cooking tonight then, Poppy offered, yawning widely. Going back to bed now. Bobby and Sarah rushed out the door. I'm worried about her, Bobby said. Why? I think she may have inhaled too much smoke during the fire. I worry that she's sick. Sarah frowned. Oh, I doubt it. She probably really is just tired. They were used to walking everywhere, so the 1.5 mile walk to the train station was nothing for them. They bought tickets, both of them thankful they were only going to be on the train for an hour when they realized the cost. It just wasn't feasible for them to walk all the way to Beckham, though. An hour later, the friends were standing in front of a large house on Rock Creek Road in Beckham. Are you nervous? Sarah asked. Bobby nodded. It doesn't matter, though. We've got to get help for our friends. I know we do. Sarah took a deep breath and said a silent prayer as Bobby knocked on the door. It was opened almost immediately. May I help you? The man standing in front of them was dressed impeccably, and was tall with blonde hair. We'd like to see Elizabeth Miller, please, Bobby said, always the more outspoken of the two. Sarah was shy until she got to know someone, and then she never stopped talking. It had always helped her to lean on Bobby, who was never afraid to talk to strangers. Do you have an appointment? Bobby shook her head. No, sir, but we've come a long way, and we really need to see her. The man nodded, opening the door wider. She's in her office. I'll show you the way. He walked down the long hall, opening the last door on the left. Miss Miller, there are 2 young ladies here to see you. The pretty blonde woman jumped to her feet. Come in. Come in. I'm Elizabeth Miller. I'm Roberta McDaniel, and my friend here is Sarah Brody. Elizabeth frowned in thought. Brody, I sent Akila Brody to Montana to marry a nice young rancher there. Keela is my older sister, Sarah said softly, missing her sister greatly at that moment. She and Keela had been the only sisters still living at home when their mother had died 4 years before. Keela had chosen to become a mail-order bride rather than go to work in one of the factories. Oh, that's wonderful. How is Keela? Happy? Sarah grinned. Oh yes. She has 2 children now, and she writes often. I'm so glad to hear it. Some of the girls I sent correspond with me for years, and some stop writing after their initial letter to let me know they're all right. Keela's not much of a correspondent. Why don't you 2 ladies sit down and tell me why you're here, Elizabeth suggested, waving to the sofa. Sarah and Bobby sat side by side, and Sarah waited for Bobby to talk as she always did. Bobby explained quickly about the factory fire. I feel responsible. I know I'm not, but it doesn't change how I feel about it. That's awful. Elizabeth said, frowning. Are you thinking about becoming mail-order brides? I'm thinking on a grander scale than that, Bobby said with a grin. I always think grander scale. Elizabeth leaned forward in her chair, her hands folded on her desk. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm hoping that you can find husbands for all of us that want them. About half the women are married, but the rest of us need to get a job or a new situation quickly. We weren't exactly well paid to begin with, and this will eat up every dime any of us has saved. I can see that. Elizabeth frowned for a moment. If you'd come a day or two later, it would be much easier for me to help you. You see, I've started a newspaper, and I'm waiting on the first edition. It's called the Groom's Gazette. It's a paper with advertisements from many men around the nation who are interested in having a mail-order bride come to marry them. I have over 100 ads in there, but it's not due to arrive until Friday. Bobby frowned. And it's Wednesday. She looked at Sarah. Sarah wasn't certain what to do. I guess we could come back in 2 days, but we were really stretching our resources by coming here once, let alone twice. Elizabeth frowned. I stand to make a great deal of money from this paper, she said. If I pay for you to take the train again on Friday, would you be willing to do that? Sarah immediately shook her head. I don't think so. We couldn't accept charity. Bobby was shaking her head emphatically. No, we really couldn't. A knock sounded at the closed door of the office. Miss Miller? Sarah looked up to see the butler from earlier. I brought tea and cookies. Also, a shipment has arrived. I do believe your newspapers have come in. Really? Elizabeth jumped to her feet, obviously excited. Bring them in while I pour the tea then. These ladies each need a copy. These ladies each need about 25 copies. Will that be enough? Bobby exchanged a look with Sarah. This was their answer. That should be plenty, Bobby answered. They all sat sipping their tea and looking through the newspapers the butler brought them. I think I want to write to this man, Bobby said, pointing to a man who said he was from Wisconsin. Sarah looked through and couldn't find anyone else from Wisconsin, so she chose Minnesota. If they were in neighboring states, perhaps they would be able to visit from time to time. Both women wrote letters to the men they had chosen, handing them to Elizabeth when they were done. Sarah took a deep breath. Now she had to have faith. God would watch out for her. He always had. It was almost a month later when Poppy hurried into the apartment, the mail in her hand. I have a letter for Sarah and a letter for Roberta. Sarah took her letter and went to sit on the sofa to open it, while Bobby went into the bedroom with hers. Sarah slowly unfolded the single sheet of paper and read the words written in an unfamiliar hand. Dear Sarah, thank you for responding to my advertisement. You sound like exactly the kind of woman I'm looking for. I've enclosed the train tickets for your journey. There were no trains that would take you from Lawrence to Duluth, so I have included 3 tickets. The first will take you to Colby, Wisconsin, where you will change trains to go to St. Paul, Minnesota. There you will change one more time to go to Duluth, Minnesota. I will be waiting for you at the train station. I'm tall with blonde hair, and I will be wearing a black jacket. I look forward to meeting you. Your future husband, Karl. Sarah turned the sheet of paper over, willing more words to appear. Was that really all he'd said to her? There had to be more. She sighed, realizing that no amount of wishing would change the letter, so she got up to go and see Roberta, knowing that her friend must have gotten her letter from her potential groom as well. Bobby rarely received letters. Her parents still lived in Lawrence, even though neither of them had anything to do with her any longer. After a moment of talking, they knew that they'd be taking the same train all the way to Colby, Wisconsin. After that, though, Sarah would be on trains for many hours longer. She would never be able to see her friend after the trip, which made her sad. She had to be strong though, for Bobby. Throughout the past month, when everyone had been scrambling trying to find new jobs or somewhere to go, Bobby had been strong for everyone. They packed together that night, having only 2 days before they must leave for their new lives. Hopefully they would both marry good men. It seemed as if God approved of what they were doing, so they would continue along the path they'd started down. Sarah enjoyed the train ride very much. She'd only been on a train once before in her life, and that had been when they'd gone to see Elizabeth Miller. This time, she was able to soak in the scenery, and the 2 women sewed together the whole way. They whispered through the nights, leaning on each other. 15 years before, neither of them had ever dreamed what was happening to them would ever occur. They were going to be parted. How did a woman go on without her lifelong friend? They said a heartfelt goodbye in Colby, Wisconsin, and Sarah got off the train, looking down at her second ticket. She had to wait 2 hours before her next train arrived, and it was late at night. She didn't feel safe. A young lady came and sat beside her. "Are you waiting for your train?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, I'm taking a train to St. Paul and then to Duluth." "Oh, I'm going as far as St. Paul." "It's a nice city." Sarah felt her heart drop. It would have been nice to already know someone from her new home. "I'm going to be a mail-order bride in Duluth," Sarah whispered, feeling as if it was something to be ashamed of. She hadn't felt that way when Bobby had talked about it, but now that she was on her own, things were changing. People would think she couldn't find a man, when the truth was, she'd never really looked for one. "Really?" the girl asked, her eyes wide. "I'm Samantha. I can't imagine being a mail-order bride." "Aren't you scared?" Sarah sighed, nodding. "I'm Sarah, and yes, I'm a bit frightened, but I know God will take care of me." "Do you think God takes care of you even when you choose to do stupid things?" Samantha asked. "I mean, if you stepped in front of a stagecoach, do you think God would save you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I don't think he would. But I prayed to him before I made my decision and again when I got my train ticket. I think he wants me to do this." "What's his name?" "Karl Schneider. I know very little about him except that he's a German immigrant." Sarah had been raised by Irish immigrants, and she knew that people who had the courage to come to America from other countries tended to be stronger and more romantic. At least her parents were. "I wish you the best," Samantha said, squeezing her hand. "I'm getting married as well, but I'm going home to do it. My fiancé, Richard, and I are going to marry next Saturday. I took a trip to see my ailing grandmother before the wedding, because I just don't know how much I'll be able to travel after the wedding." "Not much, probably," Sarah said with a smile. "Men seem to like to keep their wives close." "How did you meet your beau?" "His younger sister was a schoolmate. I went to her house after school a lot with a friend of mine, and he was always there. We started courting about a year ago, and my father has finally agreed that we may marry." "Your father was against it?" Sarah asked with surprise. Her family had always placed such an emphasis on love and marriage that it was hard for her to imagine her father denying her the right to marry. Mary had been courting from the time she was 15. "Oh yes. He thinks that women should not even think about courtship and marriage until they're 18. I'll be 17 the day before our wedding." Sarah frowned. "Oh, you're very young to marry." "I'm 22, and I'm not sure I'm old enough yet." She did like the idea though. A man who was just hers, who would sing to her, and go for long walks with her at night. What more could a woman ask for? Samantha laughed. "I'm looking forward to keeping my own house. I always knew I wanted to marry young." The two women talked during their long wait until their train pulled into the station. Once the train began to move, Sarah could no longer keep her eyes open. Why, she'd been awake for days, talking to Bobby all night every night so they wouldn't waste a minute of their last days together. Samantha shook her awake in St. Paul. "It's time for you to change trains," she said sweetly. They had exchanged addresses, planning to keep up a correspondence. "Oh, thank you. I hope God blesses you greatly in your marriage." Sarah hugged the younger girl as the two of them hurried to get off the train. Sarah stood on the platform looking around her, wishing this was her final destination. As she watched, Samantha was greeted by a young man who was smiling and hugged her close. Would Karl greet her like that? Well, if he tried, she wouldn't let him. Kisses and hugs like that were meant for a married couple, not for a couple about to be married. When she climbed onto her next train, she stared out the window, her mind conjuring up images of her future husband. He said he was tall with blonde hair, but in her mind, he had a big smile. He sang softly to her, and whirled her around, dancing close with her in the privacy of their home. He would tell her she was beautiful, and always display the best manners, opening doors for her, and holding out her chair. Her Karl would be perfect. Immigrants were like that. She fell asleep again with a smile on her lips. She would meet her Karl soon, and they would immediately fall in love and live happily ever after. Chapter 2. Karl grumbled under his breath as he stood in the cold at the train station, waiting for his bride. It had been a long, difficult day. One of his men hadn't been paying attention, and he'd managed to drop his axe on his foot. The axe had cut through his thick boot, and made a big slice into his foot. Thankfully he hadn't lost any toes, but Karl had lost a great deal of work time taking him to the doctor. Clumsiness was inexcusable in his line of work. Karl and his brother were lumber barons, each with a lumber camp on their side of Lake Superior. Once a week one of them would row across the St. Louis Bay to see the other and they would discuss any business matters, but except for holidays, that was the only time they were able to see each other. Normally after a difficult day like that, he would be able to work late, so there would be nothing extra to do the next day, but tonight, he was meeting his bride. He sighed when he thought about her. She sounded like a good Christian woman, which had been his only real requirement for marriage. She was coming to him as a mail-order bride, so he was certain that she would be hideous. Why else would a woman have to resort to marrying a stranger? Why, even ugly women married. She must be disfigured in some way, to be willing to travel all that way and marry a man she'd never seen. He wanted a pretty bride as much as the next man, but more importantly to him, she had to be godly. If the woman was godly, he could overlook her face. He was sure of it. He braced himself as the train pulled into the station. His eyes scanned the small group of people who got off the train, only about 10 of them, looking for an ugly woman, and he could find no one. Had his Sarah decided not to come then? Just when he'd decided to give up and go home, a pretty young lady had approached him. "Are you Karl?" she asked, her voice beautiful. He nodded once. "Did Sarah send you?" Sarah frowned. "Send me? I am Sarah." She looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "But, you're not ugly." Sarah blinked a few times, trying to follow his train of thought. "No, I've never been called ugly." "Is there a reason you want me to be?" Had the man lost his mind? She thought men usually wanted a pretty wife. Was Karl the exception? He shook his head, trying to understand why she was so much different than he'd expected. "I didn't think a pretty woman would ever agree to be a mail-order bride." Sarah gaped at him for a moment, wanting to hit him. She'd stepped off the train humming one of her favorite Irish love songs, expecting to find a man who would sing her praises. She'd wanted to be swept off her feet and told she was pretty, but not in an accusing way. What was wrong with being pretty? "My circumstances were such that I needed a place to go in a hurry." "Does it bother you that I'm not ugly?" she asked softly. He shook his head, taking her bags from her and striding away from her, toward his wagon. He was attracted to her, and he hadn't expected that. He'd thought they'd be able to easily settle into married life, because he would need nothing from her in the way of affection, only the things all men asked of their wives. He put her things in the back of the wagon, before helping her up. "We can't marry tonight, because the pastor won't marry anyone past 11. He's sleeping." "Oh, well, where will I stay then? It wouldn't be appropriate for us to stay under the same roof." Sarah felt panicked at the mere idea. So far, he'd been a disappointment to her, but he was a man and she was a woman. They had to avoid even the appearance of wrongdoing. "There's a boarding house on 4th Street, next door to my home. The woman running it promised me she'd wait up for you. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning at 9 for our wedding. I want to get it over with early so I can put in a full day of work." And there it was. She was little more than an inconvenience to him. She said a silent prayer that she wouldn't lose her temper with the big oaf. He pulled up in front of a large house and ran around the wagon, helping her down. She wanted to refuse his help, but she knew she would choose that moment to tangle her foot in her skirt and fall into the mud. It was the sort of thing she did when she was being stubborn. "Thank you," she said stiffly, waiting as he got her bags for her. They walked up to the house together and the door opened before she had a chance to knock. "Oh, come in," the kind-looking old woman said. She put a hand in the middle of Karl's chest when he went to follow Sarah inside. "Not you. Men do not come into this house, Karl Schneider." Go home and come back in the morning. You know better. She shut the door in his face, and turned to Sarah. I've fixed you a tub of hot water in the kitchen. I will stand guard while you bathe. Traveling on a train for days on end makes you feel like you're covered in filth. Sarah wanted to hug her. Oh, thank you so much. I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Brody. It's nice to meet you, Miss Brody. I can't believe Karl was thoughtful enough to bring you here tonight. The man thinks like a German, and there isn't a romantic bone in his body. Did he think to take you out for a meal on the way? Did he even tell you that you're pretty? Sarah laughed. You must know Karl well. He didn't take me for a meal, but he did tell me I look pretty. He said it as if it makes him angry that I'm pretty, though. It was more of an accusation than anything else. The woman shook her head. That boy needs to have someone take a switch to him. He's ridiculous. It sounds like you've known him for a long time. Oh, yes. He moved here as soon as his parents died, which was right about 9 years ago. He's a hardworking, determined man, and he's smart, but he doesn't know how to treat a woman. He lives next door, and I've been making his meals for years. Which house is his? How did I guess he wouldn't think to show you his house? Don't you worry, Miss Brody. I'll take good care of you tonight, and when you need to talk to someone about that idiot you married so you don't strangle him, you come right over and talk to Mrs. Norman. Sarah smiled as the woman left her alone in the kitchen with the steaming hot tub of water. She felt as if it had been 6 months since she'd bathed instead of a few days. She quickly stripped and sank into the hot water, so thankful she had an ally in this strange place. She frowned, disappointed. Her parents had always had special nicknames for each other, and her father would walk a mile out of town just to pick flowers for her mother after a long day at work. She'd grown up around romance and love. Now, she'd sentenced herself to a life without either. Oh, how she wished she'd been smart enough to marry an Irishman like her friend Victoria. Why, an Irishman would be romantic and sweet. It wasn't being an immigrant that made you romantic at all. It was the Irish blood. And, God help her, she'd agreed to marry a German. She went to bed after a bath and a hot meal, with the promise that Mrs. Norman would wake her in plenty of time to get ready for her wedding in the morning. She'd expected to spend the night tossing and turning, but her days of sleeplessness were catching up with her, and she fell right to sleep. Sarah helped with the cooking and the dishes the next morning, her way of thanking Mrs. Norman for her kindness. The house had 5 girls living there, and she was the only one offering to help, which surprised Sarah a great deal. Obviously those girls had not been raised correctly. After the dishes were done, Mrs. Norman asked, "Would you like me to fix your hair for the wedding? I know the service will be small, but wouldn't it be nice to know that it looked special? Before my girls married, I fixed their hair for them all the time. I'm quite good at it." Sarah nodded. "Oh, that would be lovely. Let me go and change into the dress I plan to be married in, and then I'll come back down and you can do my hair for me. I appreciate your willingness to help so much. It's not every day a woman marries a stranger in a town where she knows no one." Mrs. Norman smiled at her, shooing her up the stairs to her room with her hand. "Hurry up. We only have 45 minutes before that man of yours comes to take you away." Once Sarah was dressed, she hurried down the stairs and into the kitchen. She'd brought her bags down with her. "I changed the sheets on my bed, and cleaned my room. It looks like it did when I arrived." "Where did you leave the sheets?" Mrs. Norman asked, obviously pleased at Sarah's thoughtfulness. "I put them in a small pile in the corner of the room, so you could just take them and be ready for someone else to move in right away." "You're a good girl, Sarah Brody. I'm so glad we'll be neighbors." Mrs. Norman had Sarah sit in a chair and she went to work on her long brown hair. She carefully pinned it up, giving Sarah an old-fashioned feminine look. It was a far cry from the bun Sarah usually wore her hair in. "So tell me why you traveled all the way from the east to marry that big German. Do you dislike Germans?" Sarah asked, wondering why the woman kept stressing Karl's ethnicity. "Oh, not at all. My first husband was German, God rest his soul. He was a good hardworking man, and I loved him. But if it was left up to him, there would never have been a tiny bit of romance in our marriage. Oh, I see, Sarah said, finally really understanding. Well, in answer to your question, I lost my job, because of a fire, and needed to go somewhere. She briefly explained what had happened, leaving out the part about Bob Brown, the former owner of the factory. She had no proof he'd started the fire, though it was obvious to her, and she couldn't gossip about his character that way. So where did this friend of yours end up? Wisconsin, Sarah said with a sigh. I'm going to miss her terribly. Wisconsin's not so far, depending on what part she's in. You'll still be able to see each other on occasion, that's our hope. Sarah reached back and patted Mrs. Norman's hand. I'm glad I'll have you close by. One can never have enough lifelong friends. When her hair was finished, Sarah rushed to see it in a mirror, turning her head this way and that to better see it. I like it. Thank you so much. Now, don't expect too much from Karl in the way of compliments. The man needs a manual on how to court his wife. Sarah grinned. She really hoped the woman was trying to set her expectations low, but she suspected that wasn't the case. A knock sounded at the door, and Mrs. Norman rushed to answer it. Hello, Karl. She's ready. She looked over her shoulder at Sarah. You come here anytime you want. I'd be so happy to give a listening ear or a shoulder to cry on. Or just be your friend. Sarah hugged the older woman tightly. Thank you for showing me that I'm not all alone here. I'll be back soon. And you come visit me anytime you want. She picked up her bags to carry them to the door, and Karl took them from her as soon as she got to him. Karl led her back to the wagon, and she climbed up with his help. Are we going straight to the pasture? We are, and then I'll take you to lunch and then home. I need to get to work. I have to row across the bay to meet with my brother this morning. Why? Is that safe? Oh yes, I do it twice a month, and twice a month he comes here. We are business partners, and that's the only time we meet. Oh, I see. What do you do? Sarah was struck by the fact that she was sitting beside a man she hadn't spoken more than 100 words to. She didn't know what he did for a living, and she was on her way to marry him. What was she thinking? I run a lumber camp. My brother runs a lumber camp on the other side of the bay. Together, we float the logs across the river and my men put them on trains going out west. There are so many wide open prairies there, and not enough wood to meet the needs of the people. Do you enjoy your work? He shrugged. Most of the time. I enjoy working with my brother, and I like the paperwork. I get out with an axe whenever I have to, but I prefer to be indoors working with the ledgers. My brother is the opposite. Put an axe in his hands, and he's ready to conquer the world. I wish I was more like him. He sounds like a good man. Oh, he is. He's had a difficult time of it lately. He stopped the wagon in front of a small church and walked around to help her down. As soon as her feet were on the ground, he dropped her hand and led her to the church. He pushed open the door and called out, Pastor Clink. An older gentleman stepped around the corner of the wall into the coat room at the back of the church. Karl, is this your new bride? The one who came all the way from the east and is probably so hideous I wouldn't be able to look at her without tears coming to my eyes? Sarah put her hands on her hips and glared at Karl. And just how many people did you tell I was probably that ugly? I don't believe in violence, but I think if I had a parasol in my hands right now, I might whack you over the head with it repeatedly. Karl had the grace to look embarrassed. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I let my imagination get the best of me. Obviously. Remind me why I'm marrying you again? Pastor Clink grinned, looking back and forth between the two. I'll be at the front of the church. Join me when you're ready. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, tapping her foot. Just how many people did you tell that I was probably so ugly I'd bring tears to their eyes? Karl shrugged. I think I only said the thing about the tears to the pastor, but I told everyone you were probably hideous. Come on, Sarah, how many pretty women become mail-order brides? Sarah didn't know if she should shout at him, walk away, or marry him. The only option that really appealed was shouting at him, and she knew that wasn't what she should do. Especially if she was going to marry him. You realize people will stare at me now? And wonder where I came from, right? This is not the way I wanted to be introduced to my new community. Karl took her hands in his. I know that, and I'm very sorry, Sarah. I do still want you to marry me. Sarah took a deep breath, closing her eyes. I agreed to marry you, Karl, and I will. She didn't want to though. She really wanted to hit him. Badly. Thank you. I'll try not to do something quite this stupid again. She nodded, pulling her hands from his. She was still angry, and she'd have to pray to get over it. If he was to be her husband, she had to respect him, which may be hard for a little while. Are you ready to marry? He asked softly, worrying that he was never going to be able to make up for his bad behavior even before she arrived. I am. She walked toward the front of the church, not waiting for him. She stood before the pastor, and Karl came to stand beside her. What's your name? The pastor asked her, his eyes full of humor. Sarah Brody, Sarah answered for what was probably the last time. Her name was about to be Sarah Schneider, and she still didn't know the man. Why hadn't Keela warned her what it would feel like to marry a stranger? Pastor Klink slowly walked them through their marriage vows. Do you, Sarah Brody, take this man, Karl Schneider, to be your legally wedded husband? To love, honor, and cherish for as long as you both shall live? Sarah was happy not to hear the word obey in the vows. While she knew it was important that she respect her husband, at that moment she couldn't imagine obeying a man who was such a dunce. As soon as the word hit her brain, she was repentant. I do. The pastor seemed to know exactly what she was thinking, and he coughed to stifle a laugh, before continuing. Do you, Karl Schneider, take this beautiful woman, Sarah Brody, to be your lawfully wedded wife? To love, honor, and cherish her for as long as you both shall live? Karl nodded eagerly. I do. I now pronounce you man and wife. Karl, you may kiss your bride. Karl caught Sarah by the waist and pulled her to him, brushing his lips across hers. We're married now, he said to Sarah with a grin. God help me. Sarah turned back to the pastor. Thank you for marrying us, Pastor. We'll see you on Sunday. You certainly will. Glad to have you in our congregation, Sarah. Thank you, Pastor. She turned toward the door, Karl at her side. Are you still planning to take me to lunch now? She asked quietly. Yes, if you're still willing to go. Sarah nodded. Letting everyone he knew see her as soon as possible seemed like the best course of action. That way people wouldn't be walking up to her for weeks and months startled that she wasn't disfigured. There's a diner between here and home. Their food is good, and their pies and cakes are wonderful. How is the food situation at home? She asked, thinking about the cooking and baking that would be expected of her. Karl frowned. Well, there isn't any. I usually get a plate to go from Mrs. Norman's house. She does my laundry too. Sarah nodded. Could we stop at a store on the way home? After lunch maybe? Karl pulled out his pocket watch to check the time before nodding. If you can keep it short, that would be fine. I'm much less worried about you getting me a lot for my money than I am getting in and out quickly. Sarah didn't even know how to respond to that. She'd been raised in an extremely frugal household, and money had gotten even tighter since she'd moved out on her own. I will do my best. He stopped the wagon in front of a small diner, walking around the wagon to help her down. He led her into the small building, waving to the waitress. He took a seat at a small table by the window at the side of the building. Do you eat here a lot? She asked. He shrugged. I can't cook, and I've never married, but I've been on my own for 8 years. Mrs. Norman helps. I come here some. I eat a lot of things that don't need to be cooked. It's survival. Why didn't you learn to cook? She asked. She couldn't imagine not doing everything she could to be self-sufficient. Why? I always knew I'd marry someday, even if my future wife was hideously disfigured. At Sarah's scowl, he put his hands up as if to protect himself. Too soon to joke about that? It will always be too soon, she answered, glaring at him. I'm sorry. I really am. If it helps, I think you're beautiful. I don't think how I look on the outside should matter much at all. Have you not read the Bible? Proverbs 31 talks all about the worth of a woman, and her appearance isn't part of it. You should worry less about my appearance and more about the kind of woman I am. Don't you think? He sat back, stunned. That is true. But isn't there something in the Bible that says a wife should not rebuke her husband as well? She sat back, biting her lip. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have corrected you that way. You're absolutely right. I guess I may need to work on how I treat you, as well as worrying about what you say to me. She sighed. I'm sorry I said that. It was angry and judgmental. The Bible also says that I should remove the beam from my own eye before complaining about the splinter in yours. Her eyes met his. As shamefully as he'd behaved, she'd been just as bad by judging him. I'm very sorry. He reached out and took her hand, winding his fingers through hers. Maybe we could start over? You could try to forget I told everyone you were hideously disfigured, and I could remember that I need to see what's on your inside? And stop worrying so much about your physical appearance? She nodded. That sounds like a smart way to handle it, Karl. You're my husband now, and if we're to get along well together, there's no need to hold a grudge. I'm glad. I don't want to start married life with an angry wife. He must be smarter than he looks. Sarah nodded, more determined than ever to make her marriage to this man work. She'd said the words that would tie her to him forever, so she needed to abide by her promise, no matter how crazy he made her. Chapter 3. After lunch, Karl took Sarah to the general store in town, introducing her to the proprietor. Sarah, this is Mr. Fredericks. He owns the store, and if you come without me, he will put things on my account for me. Mr. Fredericks, my new wife, Sarah. Why, Karl, what a trick you played on all of us. She's a beauty. The older man, with white hair, a beard, and laughing blue eyes, smiled. We are happy to have you here, Sarah. Sarah smiled sweetly at Mr. Fredericks. Thank you for the welcome. I'm happy to be here. Hurry and get what you need, Sarah. I need to get back to work as soon as I can. Sarah nodded, hurrying through the store and picking out the things she needed. She piled things carefully on the counter. And I'll need 5 pounds of flour and the same of sugar. When she was finished, Karl paid for everything and smiled at her. That was very fast. Thank you. Sarah nodded. Just make sure I know how to get here if I need to come back. She thought she'd gotten everything, but with him watching her shop while tapping his foot impatiently, she couldn't be sure. Karl paid for her purchases. Please have everything delivered, Mr. Fredericks. Of course, Karl. We'll have it there within the hour. Karl took Sarah's arm and led her out of the store. We have electricity at my house, and there is an icebox as well. I've rarely used it, but I am sure with you cooking we'll need to start. His words startled Sarah. Electricity? And an icebox? Really? She'd never dreamed of having such luxuries. Why would a man have an icebox and never use it? He laughed. Yes, really. I know you have these things back east. Yes, but I've never lived anywhere they were. She shook her head. She'd seen his house, and it was much grander than she'd ever lived in, but she was startled to hear that it had electricity. Why, she must have married a rich man indeed. He helped her up into the wagon and she waited as he ran around the front to take the reins. Thank you for taking the time to let me shop so I can cook a proper meal, she said. It occurred to her that the meals she'd purchased food for were meals like she would have cooked for her family or with her friends and roommates, not meals fit for a man who had electricity in his home. She hoped she didn't embarrass him with her frugality. He stopped in front of the house, and after helping her down, led the way to the front door, opening it widely for her. There is much to be done to make it a home, he said by way of apology just before she stepped over the threshold. Sarah looked around the house, her heart filling with dismay. He had this beautiful home, and he had let it fall to this state of filth? There was very little decoration, only serviceable furniture. "Will you mind if I make curtains? And hang things on the walls?" He shook his head. "I didn't bother with any of that, because I didn't have time, and I knew when I married my wife would want to change it all anyway." He leaned down and kissed her cheek. "I'll get your bags from the wagon, and then leave you to it. Have a good day, Sarah." Sarah stood still for a moment, looking at the mess around her. He had a pile of old newspapers he'd read stacked beside an overstuffed armchair. A couch looked as if it had been slept on many times. He didn't seem to be someone who threw trash everywhere, but he certainly didn't know the meaning of the word clean. She had much to do before she was willing to even cook in this house. She heard a thump from behind her as he dropped her bags inside the door. "What time will you be home?" she asked, wondering how long she'd have to try to make a dent in cleaning. "Around 5:30 most nights unless something keeps me at the office for longer. I work Monday through Saturday." With those words, Karl closed the door behind him. Sarah stared at the door for a moment, and then she took her bags to a small room she found at the base of the stairs. Karl obviously used the big room. She changed into a work dress and pulled a big apron on to cover it. She had about 4.5 hours before her husband was home, and she was determined to make the most of them. She looked into the other room with a closed door there on the first floor and found a small bathroom, and she smiled. She walked to the sink and turned on the water, thrilled to have running water in her home. And a bathroom. She wouldn't have to use a chamber pot, even in the dead of winter. Yes, this was a wonderful surprise. She started in the kitchen, working to clean up the mess there. There were few dishes, and most of the mess was from the room's obvious disuse. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, including the stove. She got rid of the dust, did the few dishes that were there, and was just about to tackle the floors when a knock came at the front door. She hurried through the house, opening the door wide. A young man was standing there with 2 big boxes of goods. "Where do you want them, ma'am?" "Oh, would you put them in the kitchen please?" The boy hurried through the house with the first of the boxes, dropping it on the kitchen table. "Did you just move in?" With the state of the house, she had no question why the boy had asked. "Yes, I moved in just this morning," she told him honestly, omitting the fact that her husband had lived there for years. "I'll get the other box." He rushed from the room, returning a minute later. "Thank you," Sarah said with a smile. "I appreciate you bringing them into the house this way." "Oh, it's no problem, ma'am. Have a good day." He hurried out the door, and she heard the front door shut behind him. Sarah frowned at the food in the boxes. She hadn't had time to clean off the shelves for food yet, but she would do that now. And she needed to see if the icebox was empty. If so, she could put things into it immediately. The icebox looked as if it had never been used, so she set the things that needed to be cold into it. She was excited to have such a modern convenience. It would make cooking for her new husband so much easier. Her mind wandered as she put things away and cleaned off the shelves. She couldn't help but wonder if Roberta was finding her new home so welcoming. She hummed under her breath as she worked, enjoying the hard physical labor, because she was used to it. She'd always felt that a woman who forgot what hard labor was, meant she was forgetting what it was to be one of God's children. Once the kitchen was clean, she put some beans on to soak for dinner, and she cut off a few slices of bacon to flavor them with. Then she returned to her task of scrubbing the kitchen floor. An hour later, the beans were boiling and the floor was spotless, so she moved on to the next room, which was his bedroom. There was a mess there, with clothes strewn all over the floor and a bed that looked as if the sheets hadn't been changed for many months. She couldn't help but wonder why he hadn't had his kindly neighbor wash his sheets while she was doing everything else. She opened the door that obviously led to the basement, going down the steps carefully, because it was dark. When she reached the bottom, she lifted the lamp she'd brought with her, to look around and see what was there. The basement was lined with shelves, obviously meant to store jars of canned goods, but there was not one jar down there. This would be an ideal place for her to hang their laundry during the cold winter months. She hurriedly went back up the stairs to fetch a broom and her pail and scrub brush, cleaning off the shelves down there. Yes, the more she cleaned, the more she could see that this would be a perfect place for her to both wash and hang the laundry when it was too cold to hang it outside. No one wanted their laundry to freeze still, instead of drying. She would have to start on that tomorrow. Going back up the stairs, she opened a chest at the foot of his bed, and she found some clean sheets and a quilt, so she stripped the bed and made it nicely. She went to the top of the basement stairs, and gave the dirty linens a good heave, throwing them down the steps. Next, she gathered up his dirty clothes, and did the same thing, pitching them down the stairs to be dealt with the next day. She used a broom and mop in his room until it was clean enough that she could sleep in it without being bothered by it, and then she opened the window and left the door open, hoping it would air out nicely. There was a faint musty scent in the room, probably from all of his dirty clothes. She returned to the kitchen and mixed up a batch of corn bread to go with the beans, and then she stirred up the batter for a cake. She knew he'd be hungry when he came home, and she wanted to have everything just perfect for the evening meal. Sarah shook her head as she thought of how everyone in town had expected her to be deformed in some way, but she did her best not to let it bother her. She said a quick prayer to ask God to help her forgive her husband. He'd obviously not meant anything bad by it, but the words hadn't hurt any less. When Karl stepped in the door at the end of the day, he saw that his parlor had been swept and mopped, and his newspapers removed. He could smell something cooking in the kitchen, and he followed his nose to find his bride, pulling a pan of corn bread from the oven. "That smells delicious." Sarah jumped, whirling around to face him. "You frightened me." He laughed. "I said I'd be home at 5:30, and it's 5:30 now." She nodded. "I'm sorry. I just didn't hear you come in." She waved him toward the sink. "Wash your hands, and I'll put dinner on the table." "I hope you're hungry." "Starving," he told her, washing his hands all the way up to his elbows. He moved to sit at the table, watching her work. She filled 2 bowls with beans, and then cut cornbread for each of them. She took his bowl of beans to him along with his cornbread, and then went back for hers. "Would you like water or milk with your dinner?" she asked. "Milk sounds good." She filled 2 glasses with milk, and then sat down at the table with him. Karl immediately took her hand and bowed his head, praying over their meal. When he was finished, he looked down at his beans. "I don't think a meal has been cooked in this house for as long as I've lived here. I always go to my brother's house for holidays. Will we continue that tradition?" she asked, wondering what his brother was like. She hoped he had a family she would like, because she had no one here but the kindly lady next door. "Oh, I don't see why not. You wouldn't mind, would you?" She shook her head. "I have no one here." "Who do you have at home?" he asked, wondering who she'd left behind. "Did you have a sweetheart back east?" She shook her head. "No, never a sweetheart. I had some friends that I shared a small apartment with." "No family?" "My family is huge. I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers, but they're all married with children. We've scattered across the country. The only thing for anyone back in Lawrence were the mills, and none of the others wanted to spend the rest of their lives in them. I didn't either, but, well, I enjoyed my freedom. Being married takes some of that away from me." "You feel like marriage is a loss of freedom?" he asked, perplexed. Chapter 4. On his way home from work that evening, Karl stopped at the store to get his wife a gift. He looked around, trying to find just the right thing for her. She seemed to enjoy cleaning so much that he found a scrub brush and a washboard. When he got to the front of the store, the owner looked at what was in his hands. "Your wife bought a washboard this morning." Karl sighed. "I guess I don't need that then. I was just hoping to be able to find her something special. You know, a courting kind of gift." Mr. Fredericks laughed, as if he was sharing a joke with Karl. When Karl's face remained unsmiling, he shook his head. "Oh, Karl, you have so much to learn about women." "What do you mean?" "She's a practical woman, so I'm taking her a practical gift. You need to get her something she'll enjoy." "Flowers? Jewelry? Some candy?" "No, not for my Sarah. She's smart, and she's frugal. Let me look for what I can find for her." Karl wandered through the store, looking at the shelves. He picked up a rug beater. Did she buy herself a rug beater this morning? No, she didn't, but I don't think that's a good idea, Karl. Karl took it to the counter and set it on the table beside the scrub brush. That's because you don't know my Sarah like I do. She'll be happy. Mr. Fredericks punched some buttons on his cash register and gave Karl a total. After Karl gave him the cash, he smiled. I hope she only uses that rug beater for its intended use. Karl gave him a blank stare. Pardon me? Mr. Fredericks threw his hands in the air. Do what you want, Karl. But before you go, what flowers do you want on your grave? Karl refused to even answer the question, walking out to his horse and putting the rug beater across the front of him to better carry it. Sarah was going to be so happy with him. He couldn't wait to see her face. Sarah was just taking fresh bread out of the oven when she heard the front door open and Karl come into the house. She felt her heart jump a little at the sound of him. She didn't know if it was because she was nervous about seeing him or excited to see him. Maybe it was a little of both. She said a quick prayer for calm discussions and a good evening getting to know one another. Karl came into the kitchen with his hands behind his back, his face lit with excitement. Sarah walked to him and kissed his cheek in greeting, just as her mother had kissed her father's cheek every evening when he came home. She was determined to help spark some romance in the man, even though he was German. Even a German could learn. Karl smiled down at his sweet wife, so happy to see the excitement on her face when he came in. I brought you a surprise, he said, grinning at her. Oh really? And when do I get to see this surprise? She asked, her hands on her hips in a playful manner. Close your eyes, and hold out your hands. He couldn't wait to give her the gift. Once her eyes were closed, he put the rug beater in her hands. Sarah felt a long stick-like thing in her hands, touching it all over. He wouldn't have gotten her a broom, would he? Surely the man had more sense than that. May I open my eyes now? She asked, still holding out hope that he hadn't been as dense as she thought he'd been. Yes, open them. Karl took a step back, grinning as she opened her eyes and looked at the object in her hands. Sarah couldn't force the word from her mouth. Did the man really think this was a good gift to give his wife? It's a rug beater. Karl couldn't believe how well he'd done. His gift had left her speechless. That's not all. Oh, there couldn't possibly be more. All Sarah could think about was using the rug beater to hit the man on the head. What was he thinking? There is. I almost got you a new washboard, but Mr. Fredericks said you'd bought yourself one. He brought his hand out from behind his back and handed her the new scrub brush. Sarah took it with a smile. Thank you for caring enough to buy me gifts, Karl. I'm glad you thought of me while you were gone. She put the scrub brush on the work table and the rug beater propped in the corner of the kitchen. I'm certain I'll get much use out of both. She pulled the roast she'd made for dinner out of the oven and carefully put it on a serving platter. When she realized he was watching her with a puzzled look, she said, Wash your hands, Karl. It'll be time to eat in a minute or two. Karl hurried to wash his hands before taking his seat at the table. The food all smelled delicious, and he was glad he'd thought to stop to get her gifts on his way home. Thank you for working so hard for me, Sarah. Sarah nodded, putting everything on the table before sliding into her chair at an angle from his. She put her hand into his and waited for him to pray over their meal. As soon as he was finished, she fixed their plates. Everything smells delicious. Sarah smiled, not sure how to respond. She was trying to be sweet-tempered and positive, but she wanted to throw food in his face. Her Irish temper was sure to get the best of her with this obtuse man. Thank you. Karl tackled his food with enthusiasm, cleaning his plate twice, before leaning back in his chair and patting his stomach. It was only then that he realized she'd barely spoken throughout the meal. Did I do something wrong, Sarah? No, of course not, she said automatically, and then she took a deep breath. If she never told him what he was doing to hurt her, he would never change. How could he? I expected a gift that was for me when you said you'd brought me something. Not cleaning supplies for the house. She looked at him to see how he was taking her criticism. Karl frowned. You're a practical woman. You've shown me how frugal you are. How could you want something else? She sighed. Every woman wants to be spoiled and pampered by her man. Flowers would have been so much nicer. I would have put them on the table, and then dried them to help the house smell better when it's closed up all winter. It would have been beautiful, but also practical. See? He shrugged. I thought you'd want me to give you things that were needed. It never occurred to me that you would want something frivolous like flowers. Would you have wanted candy or jewelry? She nodded. Every woman would. What you gave me was practical, but when a woman receives a gift, she wants something impractical that she'd never buy herself. Karl sighed. Mr. Fredericks told me that's what you'd want, but I didn't listen to him. He shook his head at her. I'm sorry. You really would want flowers and candy and not stuff you can use? Yes, I really would. I do thank you for thinking of me while you were gone, though. I guess I should have thought a little harder. Sarah scooted her chair closer to his, and took his hand. I thought about telling you that I loved it and going on, but I didn't think you wanted me to lie to you. Also, that type of gift will just continue to hurt my feelings if I don't say something, and you keep doing it. Better that it's out in the open now, right? Karl nodded, brushing her cheek with the backs of his fingertips. I just keep feeling like I'm a bumbler when it comes to you, Sarah. Sarah smiled. You're only a bumbler if you don't learn. You didn't tell anyone I was hideous today, did you? Karl shook his head. I think I've learned that lesson. Then we're getting better. She squeezed the hand she still held. We're learning about each other together. Usually a couple learns before they marry, but we're learning after. It might take longer, but we'll make it work out between us. Her attitude made Karl want to run out and buy her flowers right then. He'd heard there was a florist in town. Certainly he could stop by after work tomorrow and get her something appropriate. Yes, we will learn together. Sarah jumped up. I made some cake today. Does that make you happy? She asked, a grin on her face. He nodded. See? You already know how to make me happy, and I'm still bumbling. She laughed. But you're my favorite bumbler. That's what matters, right? She put his plate of cake on the table in front of him, before sitting back down with her own plate. He took a bite, closing his eyes as the flavors exploded on his tongue. It's delicious. Maybe you should burn dinner tomorrow so I'll feel a bit better about myself. Sarah simply laughed as she took a bite of her cake. He may not be perfect, but he was hers, and he was teachable. Why, she couldn't ask for a better man. He sat in the kitchen with her, watching her as she did the dinner dishes. He couldn't believe his Sarah, the mail-order bride he'd sent for, was so beautiful, both inside and out. He'd expected a marriage that would help him ward off the loneliness of the long winter nights in northern Minnesota, but instead, God had provided a woman he was attracted to. He hoped love would grow from the initial attraction, because no matter how simple it had seemed to think he could live his life without love before she arrived, now it sounded like his own personal torture. Definitely it was not something he wanted for himself. Sarah glanced over her shoulder and saw Karl watching her. Am I doing something wrong? She asked, embarrassed. Karl grinned at her. Is there some law against me watching my wife? She shook her head. It just makes me feel funny. Why? It's my job as your husband. It's your job to watch me? I thought it was your job to provide. And to look at you. You are so much more than I expected. More? What do you mean? Are you calling me fat, Karl? Sarah stared at him, her mouth slack. Even he had better manners than that, didn't he? Of course not. Karl was shocked she'd even think such a thing. You're slender and beautiful. I wouldn't change a single thing about your appearance. She shook her head. Really? It was hard to believe he was complimenting her, but that did seem to be what he was doing. Karl stood up and walked over to her, removing the plate she was washing from her hands and putting it onto the counter. You're a very beautiful woman, Sarah. He cupped her face in his hands, leaning down to brush his lips across hers. I'm a very fortunate man to have found you. Sarah blushed, looking up into Karl's blue eyes. You're a handsome man. If only you weren't a German, she yelped when he grabbed her by her sides and tickled her. No, stop. I'm sorry. You are married to a German, and all of your babies will be German. You need to put the idea of a romantic Irishman right out of your head, Sarah. Or I could teach you to be a romantic German, she said, putting her arms around his neck. Do you think that would be possible? Karl shrugged. It doesn't come naturally, but I've always been a quick learner. Sure, teach me to be a romantic husband. If you think you can. Sarah grinned. Well, according to Mrs. Norman, it's not possible for a German to ever be romantic. But I will try if you'd like. He sighed. You are never allowed to talk to Mrs. Norman again. The woman is a bad influence on you, she laughed. You would take away my only friend in all of Duluth? How could you do such a thing? I suppose you may visit her every other Tuesday for precisely 6 minutes. Karl? Are you making a joke? Are German bumblers supposed to make jokes? Karl shook his head. I send off for this sweet Christian wife, and I get you. Oh, why has my God forsaken me? She pressed a kiss to his chin. I guess he knew you needed a feisty Irishwoman. He simply hugged her close. That is what I needed. After a moment, he pulled away from her. I will be in the parlor reading the newspaper. When you are finished, I'd love it if you'd join me there. Sarah slowly washed the skillet she'd used to make gravy, thinking about her new husband. She liked the idea of spending time in the parlor with him in the evenings. Maybe she could turn him into a romantic after all. Chapter 5. Sarah finished the dishes, taking the small bar of store-bought soap off the edge of the sink and giving her hands a quick scrub. She hated feeling grease on her fingers once she'd finished her chores. Making her way into the parlor, she sat on the right side of the couch, immediately picking up a shirt she'd put there to mend for him. She'd noticed it was missing 2 buttons, and one more was hanging by a thread. While she talked to her husband about his day, she could easily mend the shirt, so he could wear it again. I got all of the laundry finished and put away. I made a pile of the clothes you need mended. Are there any others you have stashed away somewhere that I haven't found? Karl looked up from his paper, got up and moved to sit beside Sarah on the couch. He didn't crowd her or touch her at all, but he enjoyed sitting close to her. I just kept wearing the things that needed to be mended. As long as I had an undershirt on, I was good. Sarah shook her head. You won't need to do that anymore. I'll keep your clothes in good repair. I appreciate how hard you work, he told her. I didn't want you to come here just to cook and clean and mend for me though. She shrugged, brushing off his gratitude. I know. You want children as well. She didn't look at him as she said it, a bit embarrassed by the topic. I do. I want a wife and children, and I want someone to grow old with. I don't want to be alone. Sarah smiled over at him. You're not alone. From now on, we'll work together on everything we do. He smiled at that. I really do like that idea. Dipping his head, he went back to his newspaper, while she continued sewing. Her fingers shook a little. He made her more nervous than she cared to admit. Oh, how she wished Roberta were there to talk about her marriage with. Bobby would give great advice, because that's what she did. Sarah made good use of her new rug beater the next day, hanging the rugs from the house on the clothesline out back and whacking them with all her might. She realized her husband may not be the most romantic man in the world, but he was the only man she'd ever be married to, so she needed to make the most of it. She had yet to explore the upstairs of the house, almost afraid of what she'd find there. The downstairs looked good, though, and she wouldn't be ashamed if they received an unexpected visitor. She left the rugs on the line and went into the house to begin dinner preparations, only planning a soup for the night's meal. She had fresh bread left to serve with it, and she knew Karl would eat anything she made. Once she had the soup on, Sarah made a slow ascent up the stairs to see how bad it was there. When she got to the top, she was surprised. There was a long hallway, and she walked down it, opening each door. There was nothing there. It needed to be swept and mopped, of course. There were 8 rooms, obviously meant as bedrooms, which were completely empty. At the end of the hall was another parlor that she was certain was meant to be used as an informal family parlor. It would be great for when children came along. She looked out one of the windows that looked over her laundry, and she could see a couple of streets over. There was a big lake on the horizon. She couldn't help but wonder what the name of the lake was, even as she hurried down the stairs to get the broom, mop and a pail of soapy water. She wanted the upstairs ready before Karl got home, and she only had an hour and a half. There were a lot of floors and windows to scrub during that time. Karl stopped at a florist shop one of his men had recommended on his way home from work. It had been a particularly difficult day, because one of his men had called in sick, and they had a huge order to finish up. Instead of spending the day in his office as planned, he had spent the day helping his men chop trees. It wasn't that the work was beneath him, it was that he hadn't dressed for the cold temperatures. His fingers hurt from the biting cold as he walked into the florist's shop, looking at all the flowers around him. "May I help you?" asked an older lady Karl had never met. Duluth was a mid-sized town, and he didn't know a great deal of the people who lived there if they didn't work for him or go to his church. "I want some flowers for my wife," Karl said. "Did you have a fight with her?" the woman asked knowingly. Karl shook his head. "No, ma'am. No fight. I just want to take her some flowers so she knows I was thinking of her while I was working today." The woman blinked a couple of times. "You didn't do anything wrong?" "No, I didn't. We're newlyweds, and I want to take her flowers." He sighed. "Yesterday I wanted to take her a nice gift, but I took her a rug beater, and she didn't think that was as nice as I did." When the woman's sour face turned to a grin, Karl glared at her. "Can you help me find some flowers she'll like?" "What kind of flowers does she like?" Karl shrugged. "I have no idea. I just met her on Monday." The woman stared at him in shock. "She's your wife, and you've only known her for 3 days?" "That sounds right." "Can you help me?" "Of course I can." The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if she was about to undertake a great task. "Tell me about your wife." Karl thought about the question. "Her name is Sarah. She has medium brown hair and pretty blue eyes. She's an Irishwoman, and she wants me to be more romantic. Her parents were immigrants, and she used to work at a factory in the East." "That's not much to go by," the woman said, opening her eyes again. "But I think I have just the thing." She led him to a corner of her shop and picked up a bouquet of flowers. "Daisies. Do you know if she likes daisies? They're pretty." "Do you have candy too?" The florist smiled. "I do have a bit of taffy I could wrap up for her." "That sounds perfect," Karl said, happy the decision was made. 10 minutes later, he was leaving the shop with a fistful of daisies and a small bag of taffy. This time Sarah would be pleased that he'd thought of her, and not try to figure out when he'd lost his mind. He called her name as he opened the front door, following his nose into the kitchen. He took a deep sniff of the air and smiled. His Sarah was a very good cook, and that was one of his first requirements for a wife, after being a good Christian woman, of course. He looked around, not seeing her, so he called her name again, a bit louder this time. "Sarah." "I'm up here, Karl." Her voice came from the upstairs, and he had no idea what she'd be doing up there. It was empty. He took the stairs 2 at a time, the bouquet of daisies and bag of candy held in one hand behind his back. He followed the sounds and found her in one of the very back bedrooms, scrubbing at a window. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning the house," she said, surprised he would even ask. Had the man never seen a woman clean before? "But, we don't even use this part of the house." "We will someday. I want it to be neat and clean for when we're ready for it." He shook his head. "You're something else, Sarah Schneider." She grinned up at him. "I'm glad you think so." He pulled the daisies from behind his back and held them out to her, a huge grin on his face. Sarah smiled, clapping her hands together. "Oh, they're beautiful." She immediately burst into tears. What did I do wrong? I didn't mean to make you cry. Sarah sniffled and shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. I love them. My father used to bring my mother daisies all the time. It just brought back sweet memories. And no one has ever brought me flowers before. Well, only my best friend Bobby, and it's not the same to receive a gift from your girlfriend as it is to receive one from your husband. He grinned. I'm happy to hear Bobby is a girl, because the name doesn't sound like it. Sarah laughed. I told her that the day we met. She took a quick step forward and kissed his cheek. Thank you, Karl. They're beautiful, and just what I need to brighten up the table at dinner. Karl pulled the bag of candy from behind his back. I got you this too. He was amazed at how happy it made him to give her something that made her smile. Sarah took the small bag from him and looked in it. Taffy. My favorite. She smiled, shaking her head at him. Will you always surprise me, Karl? He nodded. You never know. Tomorrow I might bring you a new pail so you can scrub floors. She laughed. And if you do, I'll thank you nicely. Clothespins? I'm going to finish this window and then be right downstairs, she told him, ignoring his silliness. I'll meet you down there. Does it have to be done right now? He asked with a frown. Surely she should want to spend time with him now that he was home, not scrub windows. It's the last one. If I get it done now, I won't have to come back up here tomorrow. She would make sure to air out the upstairs and keep it cleaned occasionally, but for now, there was little to do. He frowned. All right. I'll see you in a minute. He went to the kitchen and washed and dried his hands after setting the flowers on the table. When she came down less than 5 minutes later, he had his newspaper and he was reading it at the table. Thank you for waiting for me. She hurried to wash her hands and then she served the soup and the bread from last night. She would use the last of it for French toast in the morning. It was her favorite way to use up old bread. She picked up the flowers and put them in a glass and set them in the center of the table. If he made a habit of bringing her flowers, she would need to get a vase. As soon as she was sitting, her hand found his, and he prayed for them, thanking God for bringing her into his life. The flowers and candy were a lovely surprise. Sarah was still in shock. Yes, she'd told him that was the right gift to buy, but she was surprised that he'd actually done it. Karl grinned at her. I'm glad they made you happy. He looked around the kitchen. I can't believe just how much you've done since you arrived. This place looks brand new. She smiled. My mother believed in keeping a very clean home. I try to follow her example. Just don't neglect your husband to keep your house perfect, Karl mumbled under his breath. Sarah put her spoon down, reaching out to take Karl's hand. Are you feeling neglected? He shrugged. I just thought you'd come downstairs with me as soon as I got home, but you stayed up there to wash a window. Sarah grinned, shaking her head. Well, it needed to be done. I'll do my best not to neglect you, though. She took another bite of her soup, doing her best not to laugh at him. He seemed almost like an overgrown toddler upset that his mother was playing with another child. Do you work tomorrow? She asked. He nodded. I always have to work Saturdays, whether I want to or not. But you'll keep the Sabbath? She asked, hoping it was true. She wanted to spend Sunday with her husband. Of course, they'd go to church first, but after, she wanted him to be there. Yes, we'll go to church on Sunday. Maybe we could go for a drive after lunch, she asked. She remembered a weekend spent with Bobby, and her father had the stable hand take them on a drive through the countryside. It was a glorious way to spend a Sunday in her opinion. Karl shrugged, nodding. Do you like to go for drives? If it's not too cold, I love to. I haven't had much chance to do it, though. He frowned at that. What was your childhood like? Sarah smiled at that. I believe I told you that I'm the youngest of 7 children. I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers. My parents were both Irish immigrants who met in school when they were young. They married as soon as they were old enough, and Papa went to work in one of the factories there in Lawrence. She paused. Did you know that Lawrence, Massachusetts, is a mill town? Many of the textile factories in our country are right there. He shook his head. I didn't know that. Was that also where you worked? Yes, but much later. My parents were so much in love. Mama would sing as she worked, and she'd hurry to fix her hair right before Papa was due home. Papa would walk a mile out of his way during the spring and summer to pick wildflowers for her. We never had the money to pay for flowers, but that didn't matter to Mama. She was so much happier with the flowers he picked anyway. As soon as my brothers were old enough, they worked in the factories as well, but Papa didn't want any of his girls there. She frowned. He died in an accident at the mill when I was just 15. I'm so sorry. Karl had lost his parents young as well, but he'd been finished with school at least. My brothers kept supporting us, but Mama died when I was 18. She'd never been strong. Her eyes grew wistful as she talked about her mother. So my friend Bobby and I found 2 other friends to live with, and we found a job in the factory we were working in up until 6 weeks ago. Did you enjoy working there? He asked, wondering just how hard it had been on her to work in a place like that. She shrugged. It wasn't good at first, because there was a man who ran it, and he was always mean to the women. He docked our pay for every little thing. But he moved away after our first 2 years there, and Bobby was promoted to the manager. She was really good at what she did, but more importantly, her father was friends with Bob Brown, the owner of the mill. So you worked for your friend after that? Sarah nodded. Everything was so much better after Bobby took over. I actually liked my work then. Well, as much as you can like using a sewing machine all day. Where is Bobby now? He asked. Wisconsin. But she arrived at her destination many hours before I did, so I know she's far away. I'm sorry, he said, covering her hand with his. Will the 2 of you write each other? Oh, yes. I'll write my other roommates as well. And they were? Poppy and Gabrielle. Neither of them came from good homes. When you really think about it, of all of us, I'm the only one who came from a good home. The other 3 were all good people though. I do wish Gabrielle didn't have so much disdain for God's people, but I understand why she does. Bobby didn't come from a good home? Well, she did and she didn't. She was born to a very wealthy couple, who didn't like each other. When Bobby was 10, her father kicked her and her mother out, because his mistress was having his baby. She has 2 younger brothers she's never even met, despite living in the same city with them. That's sad. Sarah nodded. It is. What about you? What was your upbringing like? He shrugged. We lived in Germany until I was 11, and then we came here to Wisconsin. Father thought he wanted to be a dairy farmer, but he ended up working in a lumber mill instead. It wasn't long before he owned the whole operation. He died in a work accident, so my brother and I own the mills now. I see. Where's your mother? She died of a broken heart. Father died only a month or 2 before her. I'm sorry. How old were you? I had just turned 18. I lived with Jacob and his wife Erna for a month or 2, and then I bought this house. I wanted to live on this side of the lake, so I could manage my men more easily. Do you still miss them sometimes? She asked. My parents? Every day. Jacob is my half-brother, but my father was definitely a father to him as well. We had the same mother. Does Jacob have children? She asked. Karl nodded. He has 2. Lucas and Conrad. What's his wife like? He shrugged. We'll both meet her for the first time at Christmas. I always row across the bay to stay with them for a couple of days at Christmas every year. I hope you won't mind. She shook her head. But you don't know his wife? Jacob's wife, Erna, died in February, and he just remarried. Sarah frowned. Hadn't Bobby married a Jacob? No, it didn't make sense for that to be him. Bobby was far away from them. I would love to meet your family. Karl said nothing else about his sister-in-law, so she didn't either. Do you want a big family? She asked. He grinned. Of course. I want 14 strong sons, and then last I want one daughter. Then all the boys can help me protect her. 14 sons and one daughter? Are you kidding? Sarah clutched her stomach, not wanting to think about carrying that many children. My mama said 7 was plenty for any woman. Not for us, he said with a laugh. Karl Schneider, I sure hope you're kidding. He caught her hand and kissed her fingers. I'm not, but I'd be happy with 1 or 2. I just have in my head I want 15 children. I have to have more than Jacob, you see. It's a rivalry thing. Sarah got up to get him some more soup from the pot on the stove. Maybe you'll need 4 wives to have that many children, then I'll settle for what you can give me. After having you as a wife, how could a man want another? She blushed at his words. For a German man, you're very good with sweet talk. He laughed. I watched my father with my mother. He loved her all his life. He did? But, she was married before him? Her parents didn't like him, so she married the man they wanted her to marry, and she had Jacob. She was miserable, though. She loved Jacob, but she never loved Gunther. Then she married my father, and they had me. She always wanted more children, but God meant for her to only have 2. I think that's very sweet. I wish she'd have been able to marry your father right away, though. I think that sometimes too, but Jacob wouldn't be the man he is if we'd had the same father, I don't think. You're probably right. It sounds like he's a good brother to you. And a good father to his boys, as well. Karl watched her as she got up and served slices of the cake from the night before. Will you always spoil me with sweets? He asked. She nodded. Of course. Mama always said if you want a sweet man, you have to fill him up with sweets, to help him be sweet to you. I think I would have liked your mama. Oh, you would have. She was wonderful. I miss her every day. But you have many sisters and brothers. Do you write to them? I will. I've been writing most of them for years. Only one of my brothers was still in Lawrence when I left. Papa made it clear he didn't want us staying there and working in the factories forever. He wanted us to have good lives, and to him, that meant getting out of Lawrence. He sighed. That's sad. I think it's the nature of man to want more for his children than he had, though. I think so too. Mama hated the idea of any of her girls working in the factories, even the ones who only employed women. She thought we should marry and head west. And you did. Sarah laughed. I guess I did. She finished her cake and immediately did the dishes. He watched her a minute before asking, can't the dishes wait until morning? She turned to him, shocked at the question. Of course not. First off, I'd have to get up 30 minutes earlier to clean the kitchen so I could cook breakfast, but also, we would get bugs. No one wants bugs. He nodded. No, we can't have bugs. He took his newspaper from a chair where he'd laid it earlier. Join me in the parlor when you're done. She smiled. I will. She hurried and washed the dishes, looking forward to their time. She loved spending time in the parlor with him at night, even when they didn't really talk about anything. It was just nice to have the time. Chapter 6. When she got into the parlor, she saw he'd sat on the couch in the same place as yesterday, so she took the same spot as well, sitting close to him on the couch. Do you mind if I do more mending, or do you want me to wait on that? He looked at her, and put down his paper. I'd rather we talked to each other than concentrated on other things. I think someday we'll be a society who will be together but ignoring one another the whole time. That will be a sad time. Sarah put down the mending, and curling one leg under her, in what her mother would have described as a hoydenish manner, she turned to him. Tell me about your day at work. Karl smiled, surprised she was interested. Well, today was a pretty normal day. One of my men was sick, and we sent off a shipment this afternoon, so we have 2 weeks to get the next together. If all the men stay well, then we'll have plenty of time to get done, and even get ahead before the next is due. So did you get to chop logs today? Get to? He asked, raising one eyebrow. I had to. I was planning on staying in my office and doing paperwork, but because of my man's illness, I had to spend the day working in the cold. Do you prefer to work with your hands or work in the office? She knew he'd told her that once, but she couldn't remember what his answer was, because she'd been annoyed with him at the time. I prefer to do whatever I go to work planning to do. Today I went to work thinking I would sit in my nice warm office, and I didn't wear the clothes I needed to keep warm. She frowned. Well, I hope you don't get sick then. She narrowed her eyes at him, as if trying to sense if he would be ill. You look all right so far. He grinned. I will do my best not to get sick. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. Would you take care of me if I was ill? She laughed. Of course I would. You're my husband. Even though you don't want to have 15 babies? She made a face. That sounds like an awful lot of children. I'm not sure I could take care of that many without going insane. You could. He scooted a bit closer to her, and put his arm around her shoulders. I believe you could do anything you set your mind to, Sarah. She grinned. My mama used to tell me that. Do you want me to pack a picnic for Sunday, or do you want to eat at home first? He shrugged. If you think picnics are romantic, and would rather eat on the ground than in our comfortable chairs, then we can take a picnic. Sarah laughed. We'll eat here first. I've never been a fan of eating outdoors. I can make a stew for dinner tomorrow night and heat it up for lunch Sunday. That's simple enough. That sounds good to me. Tell me about your church. I've been going to the same church since I was born, and I've never really even visited other churches much. I'm a bit nervous about going to a new one. Karl frowned. It's a church. You met our pastor. He has a good sense of humor, but he does like to get men in trouble with their wives. I'm not sure why, but he's always been that way. Is that why he told me that you told him how ugly I was? Yes. He did it, hoping he would make you mad at me. He thinks a good rousing fight helps a marriage instead of hindering it. He says it keeps the passions running high, and you never get bored with one another. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Maybe we should find another church to attend. Karl laughed. I don't think so. He's a good man. They talked well into the night, and Sarah didn't realize how late it was until she stifled a yawn. It's past 10. We need to sleep. He nodded, getting up and taking her hand. He stopped outside her bedroom door, kissing her. Sleep sweet, my dear. You too. Sarah went into her room with a smile on her face, closing the door with a loud click. He'd called her dear. That was sweet of him, but she hoped he meant it. She so wanted what her parents had, a marriage full of love. Hopefully Karl was going to provide that for her. On Saturday, Sarah didn't have extra housework to do, so she mended his clothes. After 4 hours of mending, she was ready to scream. She hated to sit still. She knew it was unladylike to admit it, but if she sat in that same spot for another hour, she would lose her mind. She thought about scrubbing her perfectly clean kitchen floor, just so she'd have something to do, but quickly dismissed the idea. Instead, she baked some cookies and took a plateful next door to visit Mrs. Norman. The woman was thrilled to see her, opening the door wide. I brought you cookies to thank you for your hospitality on Monday night. Mrs. Norman took them straight into the kitchen, with Sarah trailing behind. I'll make a nice pot of tea, and we'll chat. Sarah was thrilled. That was the answer she'd hoped for. She couldn't stand another day home alone now that her chores were caught up. She still had to make curtains, but she had to get out of the house first. She was not one who enjoyed being home all the time. That sounds nice. Once they were seated in the parlor, Mrs. Norman asked, "How's that crazy German treating you?" Sarah smiled a bit dreamily. Very well, actually. He brought me flowers and a bag of candy. Karl? I'm surprised you were able to teach him to do that so quickly. I know it wasn't his idea. No, sadly he thought cleaning supplies were appropriate courting gifts, but I've taught him differently. Now he knows that I'm like every other woman in the world, and I want candy, or flowers, or jewelry. Something nice. I'm impressed that he's figured it out so fast. I bet he still messes up gifts from time to time. I'm certain he will. I like him, though. I think I'm going to have a good marriage with him. Mrs. Norman smiled. I'm so glad to hear that. He needed a good woman in his life. I appreciate you keeping up with his laundry and cooking for him. It made my life much easier not to have to do 6 weeks' worth of laundry when I arrived. Do you feel like you're caught up on the cleaning now? Sarah nodded. I am. I even gave the upstairs a thorough cleaning. I'm working on mending his clothes now, and I don't know what I'll do after that. Probably go quietly insane. Mrs. Norman laughed. We have a good relief society at church. The women get together and make food for the sick and quilts for the families who have just moved here. I think you should join and help out. At least until you start having babies. That sounds wonderful. Do I talk to someone at church about it tomorrow? Yes, in fact, I'll introduce you. We'll get you all set up and ready to go. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad Karl had the sense to bring me to you as soon as I arrived. I don't know what I would do without you. Mrs. Norman laughed. You'd find a friend closer to your own age, and you'll do just that at church tomorrow. I'll make sure you meet all the young ladies. Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Even as she said the words, she knew she would never let anyone take the place of Bobby. How could she have another lifelong friend of that caliber? It couldn't happen. She couldn't be so blessed with friendship more than once in her life. What about the women who stay here? Mrs. Norman shrugged. Most of them are here while they wait for their man to be able to build a house. So many men come here from the east and work in the lumber camps. Sometimes their sweethearts join them before they're quite ready. Some of the women here decided to stay when their families moved west. I only have 3 ladies here now, but that's low for me. Do you make enough money with just 3? Mrs. Norman laughed. I don't really need the money. My second husband left me with this house and a small fortune. I just take in boarders so I won't be lonely. Well, my children won't have any grandparents. Maybe you could be a special grandmother. You're not already thinking you're carrying, are you? You've not been here a week. Sarah laughed. No, not yet, but Karl wants 14 sons and 1 daughter. 14. Mrs. Norman trailed off. That boy doesn't have a lick of sense. I don't understand it myself, but that's what he told me. I just laughed. I can't imagine having that many to fuss with. I'll tell you what, if you have anywhere near that many children, I'll help you out. There are 8 empty bedrooms upstairs. I suppose it's time to start filling them. You want a little time alone first, Mrs. Norman said in response to her jest. The children will come soon enough, and as much as you think you want them now, when you realize how little alone time you have after they come along, you'll miss the early months or years of your marriage. Sarah nodded. My mother told me that once as well. They continued chatting for about an hour before Sarah finally stood. I should get home, but I thank you so much for your hospitality. I'm glad you stopped by, Mrs. Norman said. You should do it more often. Any afternoon around this time, I'm free. Come on over, and we'll talk. Thank you, Sarah said. It's nice to have a friend here. She hurried home to start the stew for dinner and for lunch after church. She also wanted to make sure their clothes were pressed nicely. When Karl came home 2 hours later, she had the stew ready to serve. How was your day? She asked, quickly serving them each a bowl. It was good. Much better than yesterday. No one was out sick. Although, John, the man who was sick yesterday, is still not up to full speed. It was enough that he was there, so I was able to catch up the ledgers. Oh good. I'm glad it was better. She put the stew in front of him and poured them each a glass of milk. After the prayer, he took a bite. I have never tasted cooking like yours, Sarah. This is delicious. She smiled. One of my papa's favorite meals, so Mama made sure it was the first thing all of us girls learned to cook. I'm glad you like it. Oh, I really do. He took another bite of his bread, dipping it into his stew. I thank you for cooking today, and I thank you for working hard to provide for us today. She wanted to talk to him about getting out and doing things with the ladies of the Relief Society, but decided that would wait. Surely he wouldn't mind if she was helping out the church ladies. Sarah woke up excited on Sunday morning, ready to go to her new church and meet people. She was still uncertain about the pastor, but Karl thought a great deal of him, and she trusted Karl, so she'd trust his judgment. She was worried about getting strange glances from people who thought she should be ugly, but she was certain she would make it through. She had breakfast ready before she knocked on Karl's door, calling out to him. Karl? Breakfast is ready. She poured them each a cup of coffee and put Karl's beside his plate, adding milk like she knew he preferred. He came out of his room yawning and moved to the table to sit down. She put his French toast and bacon in front of his plate and he took a big drink of the coffee. I need that this morning. Didn't you sleep well? She asked, leaning down to kiss his forehead on her way to her spot at the table. He shrugged. I had a lot of strange dreams, he said with a frown. Anything you want to talk about? Let's pray first. He took her hand, bowing his head to pray for them. When he lifted it, he took another sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. I dreamed about you. She wasn't certain how to respond to that. Good dreams, I hope? He shook his head. Not exactly. I dreamed that we went to church today, and everyone talked to you about how hideous they'd heard you would be. So you went to the pastor and said you refused to be married to me for another minute, and you demanded he introduce you to all of the unmarried men in the congregation. Sarah laughed softly. Oh, Karl. I'm almost used to you. Do you really think I'd do that? He made a face. Almost used to me? Is that supposed to be a compliment? He took a bite of his bacon, his face sad. She grinned. Really, I think we're going to suit very well. I can't imagine starting over with a new man now. You're too special to me. His eyes met hers, startled. I am? She nodded. You are. You're a good provider, and you treat me very well. I couldn't ask for more in a husband. Except maybe a romantic Irishman who doesn't tell everyone he knows that you're ugly. He looked embarrassed as he talked about what he'd done. She laughed. I forgave you for that, remember? She wasn't sure how she'd feel in a few hours when she was reminded of it again, but she had forgiven him, so she wouldn't bring it up regardless. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. Thank you for that. You really don't want to go find another man to marry? She shook her head. I really don't. I like you, Karl. I think you're the kind of man I could fall in love with. The last words were spoken softly, as if she was embarrassed to say them. Karl smiled. I'm happy to hear that. He took a bite of his French toast, a silly grin plastered to his face. Do you still want to go for a drive after church? It's not freezing outside yet, but it could turn colder any minute. She nodded. I really would like to see the area before the snow starts. We'll take a couple of quilts and bundle up well. And we can cuddle close under the quilts and keep each other warm. She blushed at his words. We're married, so we can. On their way to church, Sarah fought to calm her nerves. Karl sat beside her, wearing his Sunday best. His suit fit him perfectly, and he actually looked like a gentleman in it. She was so used to seeing him in his work clothes that it startled her to see him looking so distinguished. Sarah had chosen to wear a light blue dress that was better for summer temperatures, but it was her prettiest dress, and she wanted to look her best on her first day of church in Minnesota. It was always best to make a good first impression. She sat close beside him, holding his arm as he drove. She enjoyed feeling his muscles bunch under her fingertips, but felt she was doing something wicked by liking it so. When he pulled up in front of the church, he smiled at her. Remember, you can't go to the pastor and find another husband when I make you mad. She laughed. I wouldn't. Marriage is forever. He hurried to help her down, and she clung tightly to his arm as they walked inside together. He helped her remove her coat, and hung it in the coat room before removing his own. "Are you nervous?" She nodded. Petrified. "Believe it or not, when I'm not angry as soon as I meet someone, I'm a bit shy." He laughed. "I don't believe it at all." She spotted Mrs. Norman as soon as she walked in. The older woman was talking to two women who weren't much older than Sarah. She waved to Sarah to join them. "I think Mrs. Norman wants to talk to me," she said to Karl. He looked around until he spotted their neighbor before walking in that direction. "Hello, Mrs. Norman," he said with a smile. "Hello, Karl. Why don't you go talk to the men? I'll see to introducing Sarah around." Karl frowned. He'd looked forward to introducing Sarah to all of the people of the congregation. It made him feel special to have her clinging to his arm. "Is that all right with you?" he asked her, hoping she'd say she wanted to stay with him. Sarah nodded. "I'd like to meet some of the ladies of the congregation." It would be so much easier to cling to Karl's arm and hide behind him, but she wouldn't accomplish her goal of making friends here. Why had it been so much easier to make friends with Bobby at her side? "All right." With a forced smile for Sarah, he walked away from her, feeling like he'd just been passed over for her middle-aged neighbor. Mrs. Norman smiled. "Sarah, I want you to meet the two women who co-chair our Relief Society. This is Amelia Jones and Bella Adams." "I'm Amelia," a red-headed woman about Sarah's height said. "Mrs. Norman said you'd like to join the Relief Society." "Oh, yes, ma'am. I'd love to be part of any projects you have going." Bella smiled at her. "We're doing a quilting bee at my house tomorrow, and I'd love to have you join us. Everyone is bringing a sweet to share, and I'll provide coffee, tea, and lemonade. Each lady has already helped to patch some of the squares, and we'll sew them together tomorrow and start on the quilting process." "Oh, that sounds lovely. Could you maybe write down directions for me how to get there? I've been in town for less than a week." "She's just a couple of streets over from us," Mrs. Norman told Sarah. "Come to my house directly after lunch, and we'll walk over." "That sounds good. Thank you for that." Sarah was relieved she wouldn't have to arrive alone to a house full of strangers. Amelia smiled at her. "I'll introduce you to all the ladies tomorrow. And then we'll beg you to host us all. You have a bigger house, and we'll be more comfortable there." Sarah nodded, a smile on her face. The entire upstairs was empty. They could get a lot of women into her house to do the Lord's work. "I'd be very happy to have all of the ladies over." Chapter 7. Karl talked to one of his friends, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Why was he upset that she was getting to know other people? He wasn't so selfish that he wanted all her time for himself, was he? He'd laughed at other men who were that way. "You've got it bad, Karl," Joseph, the friend he was talking to, said to him. "You can't stop looking at her for even a moment." Karl flushed. "Of course I can. But she's beautiful, why would I want to stop looking at her?" He was a bit embarrassed, but he was determined not to let his friend sway him. His wife truly amazed him, and he saw no reason to deny it. Joseph laughed. "She's certainly not the ugly woman you kept telling everyone was coming." He looked over his shoulder at Karl's new wife. "Does she know you told everyone she was ugly?" Karl nodded. "Yes, and she's already forgiven me for it." "That's nice. You have a good wife there, Karl." "I think so." Karl kept watching Sarah, wishing she was beside him instead of across the church. He usually enjoyed the time he spent fellowshipping with other Christian men before service started, but he couldn't today. He was too busy wanting Sarah to choose to be with him instead of talking to Mrs. Norman. When the organist started playing music, their cue to take their seats, Karl hurried back to Sarah's side without a word to his friend. "Let's find our seats." Sarah looked up at him with a smile, her eyes meeting his. "I'll follow you." He took her off to the side of the church, away from Mrs. Norman, so he wouldn't have to share her. "Did you meet new people?" he asked, once they were seated, trying not to let his jealousy show. Really, why should he be jealous of the older woman anyway? He knew she'd been kind to Sarah, and he should be pleased by that fact. They shared a song book, and he held her hand as they sang. Her clear sweet soprano voice surprised him. He hadn't heard her sing, and he wanted to beg her to sing more. Everything about her seemed wonderful to him. After the service, he kept her anchored to him with an arm around her shoulders. He introduced her to many of his friends, trying to ignore the guilt he felt for keeping her with him. She should be allowed to meet the women of the congregation so she could make friends, but he wanted to show her off first. She was a beautiful, intelligent, hard-working woman. How could he not want to show all of his friends and acquaintances how special she was? Obviously she didn't mind, because she didn't protest. When they left to go home and have lunch, he drove from the church, a slight frown on his face, still a bit annoyed she'd chosen to spend the time before the service with their neighbor. Sarah could feel that something was wrong with Karl. She reached out, her hand going to his arm. "Are you upset with me?" she asked softly. Karl shook his head. "No, of course not." Really, he was upset with himself for being upset with her, so it wasn't completely a lie. "Are you sure? Because you seem upset." She didn't want to press him, but she wanted to take care of it if they had a problem. She couldn't bear it if they had a big fight over something just after their first time at church together. "The only thing that's upsetting me is you calling me a liar and saying that I'm really upset when I tell you I'm not." She felt as if she'd been slapped, taking her hand from his arm. She didn't know what she'd done to upset him, but she didn't dare ask again. He was acting much too prickly for her to get a real answer out of him anyway. She remained silent the rest of the way home, wondering what the right course of action was. He was angry, so she needed to know what she'd done, but she didn't want to make him angrier by pressing him on it. Silence seemed to be the only answer. When they got home, she hurried to the kitchen to heat up the stew. She didn't even know if he'd still want to go for a Sunday drive, and if he did, she wasn't sure she wanted to go with him with the mood he was in. She wasn't used to people giving her the cold shoulder, and she certainly didn't like it from her husband. Once she'd heated it, she went to his bedroom and knocked on the closed door. "Karl? Lunch is ready." She didn't wait for an answer, but instead walked to the table and poured them each a glass of milk. He came out of his room and sat down at the table, and she felt like she needed to walk on eggshells around him. His anger seemed to be coming off him in waves. He took her hand and mumbled a prayer, and they ate their meal in silence. When she finished, she went to the sink and washed the few dishes. She could feel his eyes on her. "We don't have to go for a drive if you don't want to," she said, her voice soft and a bit timid. "You don't want to go?" "I do want to go, but if you don't want to go, we don't have to." He sighed. "I want to go." She nodded, not turning to look at him as she finished with the dishes. "I'll get a couple of quilts then, and we'll go." He watched her leave the room, wondering what her problem was. She'd seemed so happy before church, and she'd been upset since. The woman was moody, and that's all there was to it. When she came out of her room with the quilts, he took them from her, carrying them outside. He helped her into the wagon before running around to sit beside her. She industriously tucked both of the quilts around them, and she sat close to him to share body heat. He drove east toward the lake, planning to take a lakeside road north so they could see the lake on one side and she could see some of the Minnesota countryside as well. He pointed out the lake as soon as they were within sight. "That's Lake Superior. It's beautiful." She'd had no idea there was such a large lake so close to them. It made her miss Massachusetts, reminding her of the beautiful ocean she'd left behind. "I'm sorry," he said softly, changing the topic and surprising her. "For what?" she asked. "For getting annoyed with you at church today." He hated admitting what he'd been feeling, because the emotions had been, well, conflicted and strange. He wasn't a man who ever expected to feel jealousy. "Would you tell me what I did so I know not to do it again?" He sighed. "Nothing really. I wish you'd chosen to stay with me before the service and not wanted to be with Mrs. Norman instead." The words sounded stupid even to him. It was not enough to get upset over, and yet he had. Sarah gaped at him. "She was introducing me to the Relief Society, trying to help me make friends here in town." Surely you don't object to that. Karl felt like a heel. No, I don't object, but I wish it would have waited until next week. I was excited to introduce my beautiful new bride to my friends, and instead, you were with Mrs. Norman. But you introduced me after church. In truth, they'd only spent about 15 minutes apart. How could he object to that? I'm not saying my feelings were right. I'm simply telling you what they were. He looked over at her for a moment. I'm sorry I got upset. Why didn't you tell me what it was when I asked earlier? Why did you wait? That had been the hardest part for her. If he'd just told her why he was upset as soon as they left church, she'd have been saved a lot of conflicting emotions. Because I didn't want you to think I was being stupid. I should have told you though. Will you forgive me? She nodded. Of course, I will. I'm very proud to be your wife, Karl. I hope I didn't make you feel otherwise. He thought about her words and realized that had been the root of his problem. Yes, he'd wanted to introduce her around, but he was worried she was embarrassed to be seen with him after he'd told everyone she was ugly. I did worry about that. Sarah shook her head. You're a good man, Karl, and a handsome one. How could I be embarrassed to be seen with you? He shrugged, staring straight ahead. Do you really think I'm handsome? He felt his heart flutter a bit at the thought. It was strange how badly he wanted to be as attractive to her as she was to him. She laughed. How could I not? He relaxed a little at her words. He'd been very worried about how she viewed him. So you still don't want to tell the pastor to introduce you to other men in the area? Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, wondering how he could be so thoroughly confused. Of course not. I'm keeping you, Karl, and you can forget about trying to get away. Grinning at her words, he drove straight out of town and kept following the lake front. Sarah enjoyed the peaceful drive. She liked the countryside the best. She'd been raised in the city, but she'd always been a country girl at heart. Do you mind if I turn the room I'm sleeping in into a sewing room, after I'm done using it, of course? As soon as she heard the words come out of her mouth, she regretted saying them. She felt funny mentioning the time when she would share his room. It just didn't seem to be something she should talk to him about. I don't mind at all. I don't know what its intended use is. Maybe it would be better if we made one of the upstairs rooms a sewing room, though. We'll want to use that as a nursery once we have children. She blushed at the thought of having children with him. We'll have plenty of time to switch things around before then. Don't you think? He shrugged. Probably. I just don't want you to get too comfortable in there, because you'll want the babies closer than upstairs, all 15 of them. Sarah shook her head. You are one crazy German. And you are a feisty Irishwoman. I think that's what I like best about you. She laughed. And here I thought you liked my cooking. Karl patted his belly. I can already feel my pants getting tighter since I married you. I do like your cooking. He stopped the wagon in front of a farmhouse. We should probably head back toward home. The sky looks like it might storm. He wished their afternoon could go on forever, though. She nodded, reluctant to go back. You're right. Thank you for agreeing to this today. I've enjoyed myself a great deal. I'm glad. I want you to be happy here. I'm sure I will be. She chattered with him about her plans for the house. I want to make curtains this week. And I'm going to make you some new clothes. Do you have anything in particular you feel like you need most? Or should I start with whatever I feel you need? I need socks and pants. Socks? I probably have just enough yarn for one pair, but then I'll need to go to the store for more. I already have fabric to make you some pants. When they got back to town, Karl helped her down. Are you going to cook dinner? Or is there enough stew left? I need to cook something. There's just enough stew left to send for your lunch tomorrow. She hurried into the house to get started on dinner while he took care of the horses. Sarah hurried through her chores the next morning, baking a big batch of cookies to share with the other ladies that afternoon. She wanted to have the curtains at least for the front parlor finished before she left. Karl had sheets hanging over the windows for privacy, and she hadn't messed with them, but she would be happy to take them down. She didn't like the way they looked at all. She was going to slowly transform the house into a place she could be proud to call her home. Once she had finished her lunch, she put her cookies into a basket and covered them with a napkin, carrying them next door to Mrs. Norman's house. She knocked on the door, and the older lady opened it immediately. "I'm glad you decided to go today, to get to know all the ladies," Mrs. Norman told her. "It will be nice for you to have friends here." Sarah nodded, feeling a pang for her old friends. How she wished she could see them all just one last time, Bobby more than anyone. Bobby had been a part of her life for so long, she felt empty without her. "I'm glad I'll be able to get to know everyone." As they walked to Bella's house, Mrs. Norman pointed out which houses belonged to members of the congregation. It was only a 10-minute walk, and Sarah was glad, because the wind was cold. She wore a coat, and had a scarf covering her face, but it didn't seem to be enough to ward against the cold wind coming in off the lake. Bella opened the door before they had the chance to knock. "Come in." Sarah stepped inside, looking around the small house. Now she knew why they wanted to use her house for the ladies. It was much bigger than this one. "Thank you for inviting me." "Oh, of course." Bella introduced Sarah to the 5 women already assembled. "We're making a quilt for a new family who just moved to town. They have a couple of young children, and not nearly enough covers to keep them all warm at night. Each time we meet, we have a goal in mind, choosing different people as the beneficiaries of our time." "That will be nice," Sarah said, handing her basket of cookies to Bella and taking a seat in the circle. "How often does the group get together?" "At least 3 times per week," Amelia, who was seated beside Sarah, told her. "There's so much need in the community. On Wednesday, we're going to knit socks for the bachelors in the congregation. They each get a pair from us every year for Christmas." "Where are we meeting?" Sarah asked. Amelia exchanged a glance with Bella. "We were hoping we could meet at your house. You have the most room." Sarah nodded immediately, briefly wondering if she was being accepted so quickly simply so she could lend her house. "I'd be honored to host everyone." "What time?" "Around 1 is when we usually meet." Sarah thought about the house, thinking about the chairs in the kitchen. If she pulled them into the parlor, there would be plenty of seating for everyone. "That sounds nice. Will everyone bring a treat again?" "Of course. You need to supply drinks." Sarah knew she'd do a sweet snack as well, simply because she enjoyed baking. Her mother had taught her that a good hostess always had a snack available for her guests. She had never been to a quilting bee before, because she'd always been working when the women of the congregation held them. She was glad she was able to participate this time. It was amazing to her how quickly the women were able to piece their blocks together. By the time she left, she felt like she'd learned a lot. She glanced at the clock on the wall, her eyes wide. "Oh, I'm going to have to hurry if I'm going to get dinner on before Karl gets home," she said right before they left, uncertain if she was talking to Bella or Mrs. Norman. Mrs. Norman smiled. "He loves to have breakfast for dinner. You could do that quickly and easily." Sarah smiled, relieved. "That's what I'll do then." She waved to the others as she wound her scarf around her face to ward off the cold wind. When she got home, she quickly made pancakes, scrambled eggs and bacon, feeling terrible that she didn't have a better dinner ready for Karl. She should have planned it out better, she realized. Next time she would. Karl didn't complain about his breakfast for dinner. Instead, he seemed excited by it. "I don't know why breakfast foods taste so much better to me at dinner time." She laughed. "I don't either, but I'm glad they do." She told him about the quilting bee. "In just 3.5 hours, we were able to put together a nice quilt for the family. Everyone will come here to make socks for the bachelors in the congregation on Wednesday," she said before popping a piece of bacon into her mouth. He frowned. "Is that why we had breakfast for dinner?" he asked. "Because you were busy out with your new friends?" He didn't mind she'd spent time with her friends, but had she forgotten him completely? "I was doing church work, Karl. I thought you'd be pleased with that." He nodded slowly. I'm glad you have a heart for church work, just don't forget me in the process. He looked around at the clean kitchen. You're my first priority. She was sad that he wasn't pleased with all the work she was doing outside the home. She'd thought he would be. When they sat together that evening, she made sure she left her mending in her sewing basket, so she could give him her full attention. She hated having idle hands, but she would rather be idle than upset her husband. He seemed to want her undivided attention a great deal of the time. It was odd for her, because she was used to always being busy. She told him about the different women she'd met at the quilting bee. I think I'm going to enjoy being involved. I'm so used to working that it seems odd to me to sit at home now. But you're not just sitting at home, he protested. You're cleaning and sewing and cooking and doing so many things. Sarah bit her lip, wishing she knew how to make him understand. As soon as I finished school, my mother died, so I went to work. I've been working 50 hours per week for years. I don't know any other way. I hate that you had to work so hard. Now you can rest. But I don't know how. He stared at her in disbelief. Of course you do. Could you take time off work, months of it, and not get bored? I had weeks after the factory burned while I was waiting for you to reply to my letter. My friends and I made clothing for orphans, we volunteered to take care of friends' children. There were so many things we did to keep busy, and we still felt like we needed more to do. Now, I come here, and you don't want me doing anything but cooking and cleaning. I can do all the cooking and cleaning that needs to be done in just a couple of hours per day. Then what do I do? My mother never had any complaints. She shook her head. I'm sure your mother was a lovely woman. She had 2 sons to raise as well as the housework and the cleaning. Do you know if she ever worked before she married? No, I don't think she did. That would be part of the difference. And having children makes things different as well. I won't be able to be as active with the Relief Society once we start having babies. I can be now, though. If you don't mind, that is. Karl looked into her pretty blue eyes. Is it that important to you? It is. He sighed. Do it then. But make sure you keep up everything around the house as well. Sarah smiled, throwing her arms around him and hugging him. Thank you. He took advantage of the moment to kiss her quickly. You're welcome. He really wished she could be content taking care of him, but since she obviously couldn't, he wouldn't begrudge her the time taking care of others. You're a good man, Karl Schneider. I'm glad you can see that. Sometimes I don't feel like I'm as good to you as I should be. She shook her head. Have I mentioned yet that I'm glad I found your advertisement and not someone else's? I wouldn't have done well with a man who didn't put God first. He smiled. I'm sure you noticed that the first line of my advertisement was asking for a Christian woman. Appearance didn't matter to me at all. Only that she was godly. I did notice that. That's why I wrote to you. She rested her head against his shoulder, content for the moment. She would keep up around the house, but she could do her volunteer work as well. Sarah was happy. The thought that she loved him surprised her a bit. When she'd first seen him, she'd thought him to be an odious man, but she'd learned that he was simply inept with women. Whether it was his German heritage, or just who Karl was, it didn't matter to Sarah. He was a good Christian man, and God knew what he was doing by sending her to Karl. She hung up her coat and sat down beside her husband on the couch again, snuggling into his warmth. Mrs. Norman said she'd take care of everything. Karl nodded, his face brushing against her hair. Then she will. May I have a snack? Simon asked from the doorway of the parlor that led to the kitchen. Sarah went to get up to serve him something, but Karl held her firmly in place. Is it all right if he eats those cookies? Karl asked. Sarah nodded. Yes, of course. Just get yourself a plate of cookies and a glass of milk. Will that work? Yes'm. He disappeared back into the kitchen and joined them in the parlor with his snack, looking at the two of them. I feel like I'm going to be in the way with as short a time as you two have been married, he said, just before crunching into a cookie. You might be a little, Karl said. But we're happy to have you here, And if you can put up with finding us sitting close on the couch or kissing, then we'll sure be happy to have you here. Simon shrugged. Don't matter to me. Maybe I'll learn something for when I'm ready to court. Sarah blushed. Did your grandmothers take you to church, Simon? Simon nodded. Yeah, most of the time. I haven't been for about 6 months, though, because my grandmother was so sick, and then she died. He shrugged. I've missed my friends there. We'll take you every Sunday, she told him. Sounds good. He ate another cookie. You're a good cook. At least I won't starve. With those words, he got up and they heard him put his plate and glass into the sink. Good night. Sarah looked at Karl. He's odd. Karl grinned. He is at that. He'll be fun to have around, though. He's gone through a lot. Hopefully we can give him enough love that he'll be able to move on and thrive. Karl pressed a soft kiss to her lips. We can. We'll pray about it and figure out the best way to handle him. Through God, we can do anything. I know we can. Sarah woke up early and got the laundry started before breakfast. She wanted to be able to spend as much time as possible helping Simon catch up with his schoolwork. As she washed Simon's clothes, she realized he had nothing that didn't have several holes in it. She sighed. Keeping her 2 men in clothes would be a job. As soon as everything was hanging in the basement, she rushed up the stairs and put the bacon on to fry while she whipped up a batch of pancakes. Karl came out as she was setting plates on the table. I'll go wake Simon, he said after kissing her good morning. Thank you, she said, watching him walk away. Her heart was full, but she hadn't mentioned her love yet. She needed to, but Karl was so unromantic. If she said she loved him, would he respond by telling her she should love him? Karl came back down, with a sleepy-looking Simon right behind him. Simon's eyes lit up when he saw the food on the table. Are you going to cook every day? Sarah laughed. 3 times a day even. Simon grinned. And you didn't even make me do the dishes last night. Karl looked at Simon. Did you do the dishes at your grandmother's house? Yes, sir. Then you'll do dishes here. Sarah's taking on extra work by having you. It's the least you can do. Shoulda kept my big mouth shut. Simon stabbed a couple of pancakes off the stack, dragged them to his plate, and added butter and syrup. At least I get to eat like a king. I noticed that your clothes need some mending, and I'm betting you've outgrown most of them, haven't you? Sarah asked. Yeah. Nothing fits like it should. Grandma kept saying she'd get caught up as soon as she was better, but she never got better. Simon stabbed his pancake savagely. Sarah looked over at Karl. Do you mind if I put making more socks for you off for a little while? Simon's wardrobe needs a lot more help than yours does. Karl shrugged. Yeah, I can make do now that you've mended all of my others. Soon, though, because I wear 2 pairs on cold winter days when I'm out shopping. Thank you. Sarah looked at how the pants Simon wore fit him. They looked fine in the waist, but they were much too short. We'll go to the store this morning before we start on your schoolwork. You can pick out what colors you want for your new pants and shirts. And socks? He asked. Of course. As soon as she finished eating, Sarah hurried to the sink to do the dishes. Karl stopped her. Sarah, Simon will be doing the dishes from now on. You can keep sewing and mending. Sarah turned from the sink, but it took effort. She didn't feel like Simon should be doing dishes, but she wouldn't argue with her husband. Yes, Karl. She got a pencil and paper and made a list of what she needed from the store instead. Were you warm enough last night, Simon? Or do you need another quilt? I need another if there's a spare. Sarah nodded. There is. You need to let me know whatever you need so I can take care of it. 30 minutes later, she'd kissed Karl goodbye, and she and Simon were on their way to the store. Mr. Fredericks took one look at Simon and asked Sarah how she and Karl had managed to have a son so quickly. Sarah had smiled, sending Simon off to find the color yarn he wanted his socks in while she quickly explained. Oh, that must be Mrs. Simmons's grandson. She was a nice lady. Sarah collected the things she needed and quickly laid them on the counter. She found fabric for more pants and some shirts. She would use Simon's clothes that he'd outgrown as a pattern, and just make the new ones a little bigger. Not for the first time since she'd arrived in Minnesota, she said a quick prayer of thanks for the years she'd spent working in the factory. Sewing was second nature to her, and she was thankful for that. "Do you want everything delivered, Mrs. Schneider?" Sarah nodded. "I'll carry the yarn, because I can start knitting more socks right away. I must say, my hands are going to be much stronger by the time I finish making socks." Mr. Fredericks grinned at her. "You're a good wife." Sarah shrugged. "Not always, but I try." She took the 4 skeins of yarn and turned toward the door, Simon right beside her. "I'll carry those, Sarah," he said quietly. "All right." She passed them to him. "I feel funny calling you by your first name. You don't mind?" Simon asked, worried he'd offend her. "Not at all. I think it's probably best if you do. It certainly makes things easier for me. I'm not used to answering to Mrs. Schneider yet." As they walked, she realized he had no hat or scarf on, and the sleeves of his coat didn't reach all the way to his wrists. "Do you have a scarf and a hat? I can see I need to buy you a new coat." She could make one, of course, but there had been a good selection in the store, and that would save her some time. "I left them in the coat room at school one day and never saw them again." "Well, then we'll have to make you those as well. Preferably before you go back to school on Monday." She could see her days would be filled with knitting, sewing, and crocheting, but little else for a while. Hopefully she could help him with school while she worked on the many things he needed. When they reached the house, she sat down beside him at the table in the kitchen and she started on a pair of socks. He pulled out his school books and frowned. "I do okay with math, but I'm really slow at reading and writing. Maybe I could just read out loud to you?" "Absolutely. I think that will work well." He followed along in his book with his finger under the word as he read, and she kept her knitting needles flying. It took her 3 hours to finish the first sock, and by then he was growing hoarse. Sarah was pleased that he wasn't as far behind as he'd made it sound. His reading was good, but he needed to be helped with a few of the words here and there. "You've done well," she said. "Let me fix some lunch, and you take a break from reading." Simon nodded, obviously relieved to get a break. He went to the sink and got himself a glass of water while she heated up some leftover beans for their lunch. She put a chicken on to boil, thinking she'd make chicken and dumplings for supper. Simon explored the downstairs while she cooked. "This is a really nice house," he told her. "Karl must make a lot of money." Sarah shrugged. "I have no idea. I've never asked." She knew he was right, but she didn't want him to think he could take advantage of the situation. "Isn't that something you should know?" he asked. "It's really none of my business. He gives me what I need to buy all of the supplies for the house, and I take care of things. That's how it should be." Simon nodded, taking a seat at the table. "Are you going to bake more cookies today?" Sarah shook her head. "Not today, there are enough left from yesterday. I need to bake some bread this afternoon though. You can read to me while I do it." "Do you want me to help?" "No, you're off school this week to give you a chance to catch up." She didn't think he needed it though. He wasn't really behind by much. What he needed more was time to grieve from the death of 2 grandmothers so close together. "Yes, ma'am." He looked down at his school book. "I'd rather work than go to school." "Why?" she asked, making no secret of how she felt about the idea. "I feel like I need to earn my keep," he said, after a long minute of consideration. "I'm not related to you at all, but you've opened your house to me. It's the least I can do to help out." Sarah shook her head. "No, you don't need to work to help out. Keep going to school so you can make a good living later, and that's all we ask. I know that feeding a boy my age takes a lot of money. Grandma used to complain about it all the time." "Did it make you feel like she didn't want you?" Sarah asked. He nodded. "I've always felt like a burden." Sarah ladled the beans into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. "You're not a burden to us. We have plenty, and that leaves you time to go to school and learn." "Does Karl feel the same way?" Sarah nodded emphatically. "He'd probably let you help out on Saturdays if you wanted, but there's no need really. Grandmother said I was lucky you had agreed to take me in, and that I should work hard to not be a burden. It's going to help out a lot, with you doing the dishes. It will free up time for me to get other things done. I promise, we're happy to have you here." She realized it was true as she said the words. Karl didn't much like the lack of privacy, but he didn't seem to mind the boy. She made a mental note to tell Karl of his feelings, so they could work together to be sure they did nothing to make it worse. Chapter 8. Sarah woke up with a plan in mind for the following day. She badly wanted to show Karl that she would be able to keep up with as much volunteer work as she wanted to do, and still keep up with the cooking and housework. As soon as he'd left for work, she put her plan into action. She quickly did the breakfast dishes, and then made the dough for 2 loaves of bread. While the dough was rising, she went to the basement and did all the laundry, hanging it on a line in the basement. It was getting to be much too cold to hang clothes on the line outside. When she'd finished, she went back to the kitchen to punch down the bread before mixing up cookie dough and a cake batter. She made the cookies for the Relief Society meeting and the cake for Karl. Before she was ready to sit down to her simple lunch, she had 2 loaves of bread, a cake, and 4 dozen cookies cooling. After doing the dishes from lunch and all of the baking, she hurried into her room to sew curtains for the rest of the downstairs windows, knowing he wouldn't care about the upstairs. She also made 2 small pillows for the couch in the parlor with leftover fabric, because she knew they would look nice. Then she cut out 2 pairs of pants for Karl, sewing them quickly. As soon as they were done, she set them on his bed. She said a quick prayer of thanks that she was as fast at sewing as she was from her years of experience in the factory. She started a pork roast with potatoes and carrots for dinner before going into the parlor and starting the socks he'd asked her for. They would take longer than just one afternoon, but she could finish the first pair Wednesday morning before the other ladies came over. When Karl got home from work, he found her in the kitchen humming as she made gravy for dinner. The table was set, and he saw cookies spread out everywhere. When he reached for one, she stopped him. "I made those for the Relief Society meeting. I made a cake for our dessert tonight." Karl frowned. "Just one cookie?" Sarah sighed. "Just one." He ate the cookie and sat at the table, waiting for her to bring his dinner. "I made you 2 pair of pants today. They're on your bed for you to try on. I made one of the socks for the first pair that I'm knitting you. I just have to do the other. I also did all the laundry and finished making curtains for the whole first floor of the house." He blinked a few times. "All today?" Sarah nodded. "I'm used to hard work, Karl." As they ate dinner, he told her about his meeting with his brother the previous day. "Jacob seems to be falling in love with his new wife," he observed. "That's wonderful. I'm sure you're thrilled to see him happy." "Yes, of course. It's just strange. He fell in love with Erna shortly after we came to Wisconsin, so it doesn't feel right that he would love someone else. He said the boys seem to like her, though." "Good. I'm happy for all of them." After dinner, Karl tried on his new pants. "They're perfect," he said, walking into the kitchen to show her. She nodded. "They fit you just right." "Good. Now go take them off so they won't get dirty." Karl laughed. "How quickly do you think I can dirty my clothes?" "I have no idea." She had seen the state of his clothes when she arrived though, and she really didn't want to think about it. As soon as the dishes were washed, she joined him in the parlor. Her fingers itched to pick up her knitting, but she didn't allow herself. She needed to follow his wishes and give him her full attention in the evenings. "How did work go today?" He shrugged. "It was a regular day. I hate this time of year, because there's always someone who is sick, and they miss work, so I end up doing my job and the jobs of others as well. I'm sorry you have to work so hard. Could you hire a few more men to even things out?" He shook his head. "There aren't any more men in the area who want the job. I've hired everyone I can possibly hire. Really? It seems as if there's always someone who needs work. I guess here there are more jobs than there are men to do them. Yes, there are. Minnesota is a good place to live. He talked to her of the wonder of there being so much work. His father had told him stories of Germany and how there hadn't been enough work for the people who lived there. Sarah loved watching him when he talked. He had what she considered a typical German look. His eyes would light up when he talked about anything that excited him, which Sarah enjoyed watching a great deal. Her Karl was a man with a passionate nature. He got enthusiastic about so many topics. She didn't know why she hadn't seen it before. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said, standing up and putting his hand in his pocket. "I found this today, and it made me think of you." He handed her a small stone. Sarah turned the stone over and over in her hand, trying to understand. "Why?" "Because it's the exact same shade of blue as your eyes." She felt a slow smile spread across her face. Maybe her Karl had the makings of a romantic man after all. "Thank you." He sat down again, his arm going around her. "You like it?" Sarah nodded. "I like that you thought of me while you were out, and that you wanted to get me something to match my eyes." She hadn't even realized the man knew what color her eyes were, so she was quite happy that he had paid enough attention to match the exact shade. "I think of you all day every day," he said emphatically. "I'm glad you took all those trains to come here and marry me." Sarah smiled. "So am I." Sarah was more nervous than ever when she woke the next day. She hurried as she dressed, rushing into the kitchen to fix breakfast. Karl looked up from the table. "Good morning. You're up early." "What are you?" She broke off as she noticed the cookies she'd baked the day before were missing. "Did you eat all the cookies?" He shook his head. "There's one left." He indicated the table in front of him. "One. I told you those were for the Relief Society meeting today." "Why would you eat all the cookies?" "There was a cake for you." He shrugged. "I couldn't sleep, and they were there. I didn't want to dirty a plate and a fork, so I just had the cookies instead." "Is that a problem?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, forcing down her anger. She could always bake more cookies before the other ladies arrived. "No, of course not. It's fine." She turned to him. "Are you hungry?" He shook his head. "No, and I have a bit of a tummy ache." She wanted to growl at him, but she held her tongue. That's what happens when you eat 4 dozen cookies. He would get no sympathy from her. "How long have you been up?" He shrugged. "Just an hour or 2. She sighed. "Let me make you some scrambled eggs. They should calm your stomach." I couldn't eat another bite. "Toast?" He nodded. "Toast with butter might work." She hurriedly sliced off a couple pieces of bread and put them in the oven, before starting her own breakfast of bacon and eggs. When everything was finished, she sat down with him. "I'll have to go to the store this morning to get more ingredients for cookies. Do you have a favorite kind you'd like me to bake for you?" He shook his head. "The mere thought of cookies is turning my stomach." With great effort, she held her tongue. "All right. Is there anything in particular you'd enjoy for dinner?" He shook his head, taking a small bite of the toast and a sip of coffee. "I really don't want to think about eating right now." "I'll figure it out then." "I'm sorry I ate all your cookies," he said. And he was now that his stomach hurt. "It's all right. I know you didn't do it just to make my day harder." He didn't say anything, because in a way, he had. He wanted to show her she couldn't keep up and still do everything she wanted with the ladies of the church. It simply wasn't possible. Of course, now he regretted his childish way of proving it to her. As soon as he left, Sarah did the dishes as quickly as she could and bundled up to hurry to the store. She had everything delivered, taking the opportunity to pick out a couple of other colors of yarn for socks for him. She wanted to make him red socks, because she liked the idea of him having special Christmas socks. She sat at the kitchen table and knitted while she waited for each pan of cookies to finish baking. Making a first impression was very important to her. She had just finished getting dinner on the stove when she heard a knock at the door. She rushed over to see who it could be and opened the door wide to Mrs. Norman and a woman who looked very old and frail. Sarah wondered if it was later than she realized, but a glance at the clock on the mantel told her it was only just past noon. "Come in." Mrs. Norman smiled at her. "I'm sorry we're early. I wanted to see if you needed help getting anything ready, but it looks as if you have things firmly in hand." "I think I do," Sarah said with a smile. "I've gotten dinner started, made a snack, beverages will be ready in a moment." Her eyes met Mrs. Norman's. "Have I forgotten anything?" "I don't think so. Everything looks perfect." Mrs. Norman indicated her friend. "This is Nancy Billings. She moved into town a few weeks ago to take care of her ailing daughter." "And how is your daughter doing?" Sarah asked with concern, wondering if she could pray for her. Mrs. Billings shook her head sadly. "She didn't make it." "I'm so sorry to hear that." Mrs. Billings frowned. "I am too. I'm too old to be caring for a teenage boy." "Of course you are." Sarah led her to the sofa. "Please sit down. May I get you something to drink? A snack?" Mrs. Billings shook her head, looking down at her hands desolately. Mrs. Norman sat close beside her, her hand covering her friend's. "The whole community will help if you need it." Her eyes met Sarah's. "I'd like a cup of tea if you don't mind." "Oh, not at all. Let me hurry and get it for you." Sarah rushed from the room and got a cup of tea for Mrs. Norman and a glass of lemonade for herself. She was thankful she'd worked so hard that morning to have everything ready before they arrived so she could now sit and visit. "How old is your grandson?" Sarah asked Mrs. Billings. "He's 13. Simon's a good boy, but I just don't know how I'm going to properly care for him." Mrs. Billings turned her hands over. "He lost both of his parents when he was small, so my daughter, his grandmother, was raising him. She became ill and died last week, so I'm the only person he has left." Sarah's heart went out to her. "Is your health good?" she asked softly, feeling there was something that was being left out of the conversation. The older woman shook her head. "Not at all. My heart is going to give out at any time, but I don't want poor Simon to be raised in an orphanage." Sarah shook her head. "I'm sure that won't happen." "I'm sure it will," Mrs. Billings said sadly. "When my daughter died, I went all over town hoping to find someone who could take him in, but no one would." Sarah bit her lip for a moment, knowing she was doing the wrong thing, but she did it anyway. "If something happens to you, and there's no one else, Karl and I will take him in." Mrs. Billings gawked at her. "You've never even met the boy." "You can't say that." Sarah shrugged. "No, I've never met him, but I know what it is to be orphaned young with nowhere to go. So does my husband. We'll take him." She would tell Karl what she'd agreed to as soon as he got home, and she prayed he wouldn't be angry with her. She would do whatever she could for the boy. Mrs. Norman smiled at Sarah and nodded, as if she'd known that would be Sarah's answer. Sarah only hoped her husband wouldn't want to have her head when he heard what she'd said. There was a knock at the door, and the small work party began, with Sarah hovering and getting drinks and snacks for everyone. Amelia looked around the parlor and nodded, her face excited. "I don't think it matters how big our meetings get if you're willing to always host them here, Sarah." Sarah nodded, knowing she was probably agreeing out of turn. In less than an hour, she agreed to take on a teenage boy to raise and open her home 3 days a week. Surely Karl would do his best to understand before he strangled her. They were able to make 6 pairs of socks that afternoon as the sound of laughter mixed with the clickety-clack of a dozen knitting needles. As everyone left, Sarah looked around at the house, realizing that all of the ladies had taken the time to pick up after themselves. She only had to wash the few dishes they'd used, and the house would look normal, well, after she got the chairs back into the kitchen that was. Surely 3 times a week having the ladies there wouldn't interrupt their routine too much. She was putting dinner on the table when Karl came in. "Are you feeling better?" she asked, going to him and kissing his cheek. He nodded. "How was your day?" "Busy." I finished your socks. Oh, good. He seemed surprised, as if he hadn't thought she could do it and keep up with all the other things she had going. Did anything exciting happen? Sarah bit her lip, sitting down to explain about Mrs. Billings and her promise. I couldn't let the woman keep fretting over what would happen to the boy if she died. Karl shook his head. I wish you'd asked me first. Sarah frowned, wringing her hands together. What would you have said? He sighed. I'd probably have agreed, but I would have liked to at least be consulted about it. I understand. Please forgive me. He closed his eyes, annoyed, but not angry. I know why you did it. He was sitting at the table, and he caught her at her waist, pulling her to him. I just want us to have some time alone together. He cupped her cheek with his hand and pulled her down for a sweet kiss. I feel like you're jumping into life here with both feet and without a look forward. For a little while, I want to be the most important thing in your life. Sarah smiled. Well, God comes first, but you're only a little below him, she said with her eyes twinkling. Karl, I put you before everything and everyone. I spent all morning thinking about how you would be least affected by people being in our home all day. He frowned at that. I'm not trying to make things harder on you, but I do want you to consider me before you do all these things. He sighed. I feel like I'm having to compete with the whole world for my new wife's attention. So you'll take him in if something happens? Karl nodded. Of course I will. Do we even know his name? Sarah's eyes widened. I think it's Simon, but I'm not sure. Does it matter? Karl laughed. I guess not. Sarah, your heart is too big. You care too much about everyone but yourself. You'll work yourself into an early grave. That may be so, but I don't know any other way to be. I love people. How could I not do everything I can for them? Chapter 9. After church on Sunday, Karl had 2 of his workers over for lunch, and they helped him move the furniture from the room Sarah was using up the stairs. They decided together that if they were possibly going to take Simon in, they wanted the house ready for him. Sarah had no problem sleeping upstairs for the next couple of weeks as they finished getting to know each other. Sarah enjoyed meeting his men, and agreed to go to work with him for a bit on Monday morning, so she could meet his older brother, Jacob. She would have to hurry home, though, so she could make sure she was ready to host the ladies in the afternoon. Karl's brother was a surprise to Sarah. He was as dark as Karl was fair. It's nice to meet you, she mumbled as she met him. Jacob's eyes seemed hard to Sarah as he looked at her. Nice to meet you. Jacob's accent was a great deal more pronounced than Karl's as well. To Sarah, Karl spoke English perfectly with a German accent hinting at 1 or 2 words. Jacob, though, his voice sounded as if he was more comfortable with the German language than with English. It didn't surprise her at all when Jacob switched to German almost immediately, effectively cutting her out of the conversation. Karl had assigned one of his men to drive her home after she met his brother, and that man stepped forward. If you'll come with me, Mrs. Schneider. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Had she really spent time getting ready and traveling to work with Karl just to spend 2 minutes meeting her brother-in-law? She stepped forward to kiss Karl's cheek before she left for home, wondering if she should speak to Karl about his rude brother. She wasn't at all impressed with Jacob, and really, she had no desire to meet his children if the rude man had raised them. After she was dropped off at the house, she hurried to bake cookies for the ladies that afternoon. She made twice as many as she would have otherwise so that Karl could have some. She would never again bake something for the Relief Society and not extra for Karl. She'd learned her lesson there. Just before she sat down to lunch, she received a letter, and she tucked it in the pocket of her apron to read with her lunch. She loved receiving letters, and this was the first she'd received since her marriage to Karl. As soon as she'd prayed, she pulled the letter out, her eyes eating up the words from her friend. Dear Sarah. Thank goodness Miss Miller had your address. I miss you so much and can't wait to hear how you are. What is your husband like? Are you happy? Mama was terribly ill when I got back to Vermont. She passed on a few hours after I arrived. No words can express how hard that was for me. I wish I could have faith and believe that all is well, as I know you and Roberta would both say, but as you well know, it's just not in me to think that way. There was no work for me in Vermont, so I had to move on. I know I said I'd never marry, but there was nothing left for me to do than try to become a mail-order bride. To that end, I spent this very day with Elizabeth Miller, who found a suitable solution for me. I told her if she could locate the kind of fellow I really wanted, I'd be on the next train. And she did. I'm leaving for Texas in a matter of hours. Texas? Can you imagine a city girl like me heading out west? It's really preposterous. Please write to me in Coltonville and let me know how you've fared in your new life. I don't want to lose you. Your friend, Gabby. P.S. Poppy has gone to Alaska. Sarah said a prayer for Gabrielle as she finished her lunch. She wanted her friend to find happiness very badly, but more than that, she wanted her to find God. For as long as Sarah had known her, Gabby had felt strong resentment toward God, and she really wanted her to realize that the people on earth who called themselves his, were not always good indicators of who he was. Just as she finished the lunch dishes, she heard a knock, and she rushed to the door. Mrs. Norman stood there with tears streaming down her face. I'm going to Mrs. Billings. The doctor isn't certain she'll make it through the day. What can I do to help? Sarah asked, desperately wishing she could go with her friend, but there were too many people due at her house within the hour for that to be feasible. Have everyone pray for her. I hope you have a room ready for Simon. Sarah quickly hugged Mrs. Norman. I do have a room ready. If you think Mrs. Billings will rest easier knowing that, please tell her. I will. I'll let you know if anything changes. With that, Mrs. Norman hurried away. Sarah wished there was more she could do than pray for the elderly woman, but she knew prayers were important. Karl had just walked in the door after work that evening when there was another knock. Sarah hadn't even had the chance to tell him about what was happening with Mrs. Billings yet as he rushed to the door, while she put the food on the table. Karl came back into the kitchen, followed by Mrs. Norman and a young teenage boy she'd never seen before. She understood immediately, and smiled at him, going forward to take his hand. I'm Sarah. The boy nodded, his eyes dry, but he seemed unsure of himself. He obviously didn't want to be there, but he had nowhere else to go. I'm Simon. Are you hungry? He nodded, and she took another bowl from the shelf for him to have some of the hearty stew she'd made for their supper. Let's eat, and then I'll change the sheets on your bed. Did you bring your things? Yes'm. They're by the front door. We'll get you all sorted out as soon as we've had dinner. Sarah's eyes met Karl's and he nodded slowly, indicating that he was ready for this. Sarah was a little nervous, because there were only 2 beds, so this meant she would have to share with Karl much earlier than planned, but that would go how it would. She refused to worry about it. She cared for the man, and she knew he cared for her. Mrs. Norman quickly excused herself, promising to help if there was any trouble. After they prayed, Karl asked the boy questions, trying to draw him out and get to know him better. Do you enjoy school? Simon shook his head. No, sir. I hate it. Why's that? Simon explained that he'd been to schools in 6 states, and he had fallen behind. I feel like a dunce. Would you allow me to help you catch up? Sarah asked, wanting to make sure he would stay in school. Her brothers had both dropped out around his age to start working, and she wanted better for him, for everyone. Simon shrugged. I guess. Karl said, the funeral will be Friday, from what Mrs. Norman said. Why don't you take the week off school? Sarah can help you catch up, and you can go back Monday. Simon made a face. What do you do? I run a lumber camp. Why can't I work there? I can chop down trees. You're too small, Karl said automatically. When you've grown another 7 or 8 inches, we'll talk. Sarah frowned. What if he does that in the next year? Surely Karl wouldn't allow him to work instead of going to school. Then we'll talk, Karl said, not backing down. He knew Sarah wanted the boy to get an education, but he also knew the boy would do fine if he started working right away. His brother hadn't gone to school past the age of 13, and he ran a lumber camp. He couldn't even read English. Sarah said nothing in response. She refused to argue in front of Simon, but she would tell Karl exactly how she felt later. Simon grinned. "You mean it?" Karl nodded. "I do." Sarah changed the subject to avoid getting angry and saying something she shouldn't. "Do you need your clothes washed tomorrow, Simon?" "I have to do laundry tomorrow anyway." "Yes'm, grandmother hasn't been able to wash my clothes for a while." He looked down at his bowl, stirring the soup around, but not eating much. "Are you healthy?" Sarah understood his question immediately. "Yes, we're both healthy." "You're not going to lose us?" Simon shrugged. "Hope not." He acted nonchalant about it, but Sarah knew better. The boy wanted a permanent home. After supper, Sarah took care of changing the sheets on the bed in Simon's room and getting her things out. She didn't want the boy to know she hadn't been sleeping with her husband. Too many questions would be asked that she wasn't ready to answer. When she had his room ready for him, she led him up the stairs to show him where he'd sleep. He looked at all the empty rooms up there in surprise. "Planning to have a lot of kids?" Sarah laughed. "Karl thinks we should have 14 boys and 1 girl. I hope we can count you as one of the boys, because I'm not sure about having that many." Simon smiled slightly. "How long have you been married?" "Just 2 weeks. That's not very long." "No, it's really not. We're still getting to know each other in a lot of ways." Simon nodded. "Well, I'll put my things away. Take any dirty clothes and throw them down the basement steps. I'll get them washed tomorrow." "Yes'm." Sarah hurried back down the stairs into the kitchen. She washed and dried the dishes quickly, before joining Karl in the parlor. She took the spot beside him on the couch. "I want him to stay in school." "I know you do. I don't think it's terribly important though. He's been in long enough that he should know how to read and write. He should be able to do some ciphering. Not much more is really necessary." "I disagree. I think he should stay in school and learn as much as he can." "What if he discovers that he wants to be a doctor? Or a lawyer?" "He'll never learn to do either of those things unless he finishes school and goes on to college." Karl shrugged. "My brother stopped school right around his age. He does well. He can support his family with no problem. I think the choice should be left up to Simon when he's big enough." Sarah sighed. "I'm not going to win this argument, am I?" "No, you're not. He's already too old to change his ways. His opinions are already formed on most things. He'll do what he's going to do. We'll guide him as best we can, but we can't make every little decision for him." "No, you're probably right." She shook her head. "I'm going to have to find a way to let the ladies know we won't be holding Relief Society meetings here for the rest of the week. I need to work with Simon on his school and see what we can do to catch him up." Karl reached out and took her hand, winding his fingers through hers. "I think that's a very good idea. Why don't you talk to Mrs. Norman and have her spread the word?" Sarah nodded, jumping to her feet. "I'll go do that now. It'll just take me a minute or two." Karl nodded, watching her go with a frown. His Sarah couldn't sit still to save her life. How he wished she was a quiet demure woman, instead of a feisty Irishwoman. Of course, he knew she wouldn't change, and she was pretty special as she was. Sarah quickly asked Mrs. Norman to get a message to the Relief Society's leaders so they could tell the others. She simply couldn't ask Simon to deal with the people in the house while she was working on teaching him. "I'll handle that for you. You just take care of Simon, thank you so much. And thanks for bringing him to us. He's going to be a lot of work." Sarah knew in her heart that she wanted to help the boy as much as she could. Mrs. Norman smiled sadly. "All children are." Sarah said good night softly, going back home to sit with Karl, her heart beating rapidly. This would be their first night to share a room, and she was nervous to be sleeping so close to him. She knew she loved him, though, so she'd be fine. Chapter 10. At dinner that night, Karl brought up something Sarah hadn't yet thought of. Have you considered what gifts we'll take to my brother, his wife and their boys for Christmas? Sarah gaped at him for a moment. I don't even know them. How will I know what to take? He shrugged. She's a new wife. I'm sure she could use some new recipes. I'll figure out something for Jacob. The boys are easy to please. Find them some trains from the store. I can't give them something so impersonal. Sarah felt like she needed to stop doing everything and work on Christmas presents now. How would she ever get everything she needed to do finished? I'm going to have to start mending while we talk in the evenings, Karl. There's just no way around it. He nodded. That's fine. And Simon's doing the dishes, so that will give you more time a couple of times a day. Sarah sighed. I'll figure something out for everyone. Simon looked back and forth between them. I have a good hand with whittling, he announced. I could make the boys some wooden critters to set around. Sarah gaped at him. You could? He nodded. I like doing it, and they end up right pretty. I'll let you do that then. Sarah looked at Karl. Any ideas what kind of animals the boys would like? He shook his head. Use your imagination. No, wait, make Lucas, the younger boy, a skunk. I always tell him he stinks like a polecat. And the older boy, let me think. He made a face, thinking for a minute. Make a pig for the older boy, Conrad. Karl grinned, happy to find a way to insult the boys even as he gave them gifts. Sarah just shook her head. I can make a quilt for Jacob and his wife. What is her name anyway? Karl frowned. I think it's Roberta. I'm not sure, though. Sarah just gaped at him. Roberta? She wasn't a mail-order bride from Massachusetts, was she? I think she was. Why? Sarah dropped her fork and put her hands over her face, jumping up and rushing from the room. It couldn't be true. She and Roberta were married to brothers? And so close, without ever realizing it? She wanted to insist Karl row her across the bay immediately, but then she realized she was due to see her on Christmas Day. There wasn't a better surprise for her lifelong friend than her. She looked up as she dried her tears. Karl sat beside her on the bed. What did I say? I think your brother married my best friend. We thought we were going to be very far apart, because of how much longer my train ride took than hers. But, I'm sure it's her. Is that a bad thing? He asked, confused by her reaction. Well, I wasn't impressed with your brother when I met him, but no, it's not a bad thing at all. Then why are you crying? I don't understand. Sarah sniffled, taking the handkerchief he offered her. I'm crying because I'm happy. I'm going to see my friend, and I was worried we may never see each other again. Why, from what you said, we'll be close enough to visit frequently. So you're crying because you're happy? Because that makes no sense to me. He still wasn't sure what had happened. I don't expect it to make sense to you. That's the way it is, though. She brushed the tears off her face. I'm sorry to seem so crazy. I'll be fine. I don't want you to tell Jacob what we figured out though. I want to surprise Bobby on Christmas morning. I'm not sure it's the same person. Jacob said her name was Roberta. Bobby's name is Roberta. All of her friends call her Bobby, though. Karl shrugged. Don't get your hopes up too high. I don't want you to be sad over Christmas. Sarah shook her head. I won't be. I promise. Sarah felt like her life had become like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up more and more snow, and people and debris, as it rolled. All she could think about was Christmas. The holiday had always been special for her, but never like it was that year. In the 6 weeks leading up to the day, she did little but sleep, eat, and work, but she didn't complain one bit. Her days were filled and she was gloriously happy. Simon went back to school and no longer complained about being behind. Sarah suspected he'd never really considered himself behind, but had wanted to get out of going so he could contribute. Once he understood the only contributions they wanted from him were doing the dishes and going to school, it was as if a weight was off his shoulders. Every day he seemed to adjust a little better. A few days before Christmas, Sarah went to the doctor, because she was worried she was expecting. Well, not worried exactly, but she thought she might be, and she couldn't think of a better Christmas gift for her Karl than a baby. She left the doctor's office an hour later, feeling a bit shocked. Even though she'd suspected the news, hearing the doctor say the words surprised her. She couldn't believe it had happened so quickly for them. She had all of her presents ready and wrapped, including one for Simon from Jacob's family. She didn't want Bobby to feel bad, but she wanted to surprise her as well. Karl assured her his brother's house had room for all of them. They would leave Christmas Eve and stay through the 26th, which seemed a long time to Sarah, but Karl told her they shut down the lumber camps from Christmas Eve through January 2nd every year, to give the men time to celebrate with their families. She walked into the store on her way home and bought a skein of yarn, deciding to tell Karl she was expecting by making him a pair of baby booties for Christmas. He would open the gift and know what she was trying to tell him. She couldn't wait. She hurried home and started crocheting the booties immediately, knowing she had little time to finish. They'd be leaving just after lunch on Christmas Eve, and that was only 2 days away. She couldn't decide if she was more excited to see Bobby or to give Karl the gift to let him know about the baby. On the morning of Christmas Eve, while Simon was washing the dishes, Sarah pulled Karl into the parlor and pulled the gift she'd carefully wrapped in brown paper from the pocket of her apron. "I want to give you something a little early," she said. Karl frowned. "But I didn't get you anything to give you early." "That's okay. This isn't your main gift." He turned it over in his hands with a frown, untying the string she'd used to secure the paper. 2 tiny little socks fell out, and he frowned at them. "These won't even fit my big toes." "No, they won't. They're not meant for you." "Then why are you giving them to me?" he asked, confused. Sarah shook her head, the smile pricking the corners of her mouth. "Well, there's something we'll be able to use in about 8 months." He frowned at that. "Why give them to me now then?" Sarah put her hands on her hips. "Think about it, Karl. Don't add the word dense to your title as well as bumbler." He looked down at them again and his eyes grew wide. "Are you saying, Sarah, are we going to have a baby?" Sarah nodded, her face lit up with happiness. Karl grabbed her and hugged her tightly. "When I sent for you, I never imagined that I would get a beautiful bride. Then you came, and I never imagined that I would love you the way I do, and now, a baby. You've made me the happiest man alive." Sarah pulled back and looked up into his face. "Did you just say you love me, Karl?" He frowned. "Haven't I told you that?" She shook her head. "No, you haven't." "Well, I'm sure I have." He looked at her intently. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I think that's something I would remember." He cupped her face in his hands, looking into her beautiful blue eyes. "Sarah Schneider, I never dreamed I could love a woman the way I love you. I'm so glad you're my wife." "I love you too, Karl. I've known for so long, but I wasn't sure how to tell you." They heard slow clapping from the door that led to the kitchen and looked over to see Simon watching them. "Is the show over? Can I finish the dishes now?" Karl looked over his shoulder at the boy. "Go away, Simon. There's about to be some kissing going on here." Simon groaned. "When isn't there kissing going on here?" He wandered back to the kitchen. Sarah shook her head. "I do think he's comfortable here." Karl laughed. "Someone needs to take a switch to him." He kissed her softly. "You make me very happy." Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, thrilled to be married to this man. "And you make me happy." Sarah bundled up as warm as she could for the rowboat ride across the bay. One of Karl's men was driving them to the lumber camp where Karl stored his boat. Sarah handed Karl the bag of presents she'd carefully wrapped, and Karl handed the smaller bag that contained all of Sarah's presents to Simon. Sarah was so excited she could barely contain herself. She had 2 letters from friends back home to share with Bobby, so she'd brought them along, unread. She thought it would be more fun to read them with her friend. When they were in Jacob's wagon on their way to his house, Sarah bowed her head and said a silent prayer. Please God, let me be right about who is married to that man. I so badly want to see Bobby. Don't let this all be wishful thinking. When they got to the house, Karl helped her down before grabbing the bag of gifts. He took Sarah's hand and guided her up the icy path to his brother's house with Simon trailing along behind them, looking nervous about whether he'd be accepted. Jacob opened the door and bellowed his wife's name. Bobby. Our guests are here. As soon as he used the familiar nickname, Sarah began crying again. She couldn't help it. Jacob looked at her, taking a step back. Bobby walked into the room, looking as lovely as Sarah remembered, and Sarah said nothing as she rushed to her friend. She didn't wait for any words to be spoken, but instead she pulled Bobby into a hug. Sarah? How? Sarah pulled back and saw Bobby's face mirrored her own. I realized about 6 weeks ago that it must be you Jacob had married. At first I couldn't believe it, but how many Robertas could have been mail-order brides, going from Massachusetts to Wisconsin in November? Roberta shook her head, her eyes still streaming. A handkerchief appeared before her and she took it, not looking at Jacob who gave it to her before drying her face delicately. You knew 6 weeks ago that we were this close? And you didn't tell me? Sarah shrugged. I couldn't tell you until I was sure. And I wanted to surprise you for Christmas. Surprise? Bobby grabbed her, hugging her again. I can't believe you're really here, and we're sisters. We are. Sarah waved Karl and Simon forward. Bobby, this is my husband, Karl, and well, how do you want to be introduced, Simon? Simon grinned. Favorite boy you took in off the streets? Sarah frowned at him. You were never on the streets. She turned to Bobby and explained quickly where Simon had come from. I hope you don't mind. No, of course not. Bobby leaned forward and whispered, I don't have a present for him. I made an extra for you to give him, Sarah whispered back. It's nice to meet you, Simon, Bobby said with a smile, as if she hadn't just been rudely whispering in front of him. And you, Karl. Karl looked between Bobby and Sarah. I have a feeling we're going to be arranging a lot of trips across the bay, Jacob. Jacob smiled at Bobby. As long as it keeps my wife happy, I will do anything. Sarah smiled at her new brother-in-law. I think I'm going to have to like you after all. Jacob didn't respond. Sarah wasn't even certain he'd hurt her. He had eyes only for his bride. Sarah looked at Bobby and saw that she was looking at Jacob with the same loving expression. Well, I don't have to ask if you're happy, Bobby. I'm married to a kind, loving, Christian man. How could I be anything but happy? There was a loud yipping sound, and Sarah turned just in time to have a puppy pounce on her shoelaces. She laughed, squatting down to greet the dog. What's his name? Squirt, Bobby said with a grin. He was the runt of a litter and the boys found him all but frozen. We found a cat to nurse him, and he's grown beautifully. A boy ran into the parlor and grabbed Squirt around the neck. Sorry, Frogmutter. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't. Bobby shook her head. This is my youngest, Lucas, who refuses to call me anything but Frogmutter. Why? Sarah wasn't certain that she wanted to know, but she couldn't not ask. It was like a carriage accident, where you couldn't look away, even when it was all you wanted to do. Because she doesn't look like a frog, Lucas said by way of explanation, before running out of the room. That doesn't make sense to me, Sarah said, still confused. Get used to it. Nothing makes sense in this household. I heard that. Jacob said. Don't you have horses to take care of? Roberta asked. Jacob shook his head at his wife. Come help me, Karl. We will leave these women to their crying. Simon followed along with the men, obviously not wanting to put up with the crying either. Let me show you to your room, Bobby said, suddenly remembering her job as hostess. Sarah followed Bobby into the small room and smiled. This looks lovely, Bobby. I stayed here for a while when I first got here. It's a good room. I have letters from Hope and Poppy with me. I decided to wait to read them until we were together. Tears sprang into her eyes again. I just can't believe we're really together. Why were you on a train so much longer than I was? Bobby asked. That's the only thing I don't understand. There's no train that goes over the lake, Sarah explained. Instead of having me arrive with you and rowing me across the bay, Karl had me go to Minneapolis, and then up to Duluth. If he'd realized we were traveling together, he would have chosen the much cheaper option of having me come through Superior and rowing me across the bay. Bobby shook her head. It's amazing, isn't it? All of our friends I've heard from are happy. Maybe Bob Brown burning that factory to the ground was a good thing after all. I certainly wouldn't go back to the way things were. I'm happy with Jacob and the boys. And I'm happy with Karl and Simon. Oh, there are days when they both make me crazy, because I love them so much, but most days? I'm happy to be with them both. My life is so much better here. Mine too. Bobby sat down on the bed and patted the spot beside her. Let's see your letters. Sarah pulled the 2 letters she had from her pocket, handing one to Bobby. She knew her friend would have no qualms about reading it. It was from their friends after all. The letter Sarah had kept was from Poppy. My sweet Sarah, I hope you're staying warm in Minnesota. If you can believe it, I will soon be somewhere even colder, Alaska. Not long after you left Lawrence, I responded to an ad in the Groom's Gazette. I am now married to Matthew Turner, a fine doctor who is taking me to Sitka in the morning. Don't be alarmed, and please don't tell Roberta as she will only worry, but ours is not a typical union. It's a marriage in name only, which is a tremendous relief to me. You see, the group that wanted to send Matt to the wilds of the north requires their people to be married. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but he's even less interested in the bonds of matrimony than me. I will write again when I am settled, so please continue to send letters to my mother's address. I'm desperate to hear news from you. Love, Poppy. For a moment, Sarah considered not handing the letter to Bobby because of what Poppy had said about not telling her, but she wasn't telling her. Poppy was. They traded letters, and she read the words of Hope, who had moved to New Jersey. Dear Sarah, you sound so happy, I couldn't be more pleased for you. I'm happy too, almost blissfully so. Right now, the seamstress is finishing my wedding gown, and I'm to marry Roscoe Edwards as soon as it's done. I can't even begin to explain how I feel. I had anticipated a life of civility, perhaps even friendship, but I've fallen in love, which is so much more than I dreamed about. He's a good man, if an unusual one, and I believe I will be happy with him for the rest of our lives. I will write you again soon and tell you all about the wedding. Congratulations on your new happy life, and I know that once the people of Minnesota come to know you, they will adore you. Take care. Hope. Sarah smiled as she finished the letter, content now that she knew the friends she considered the closest were happy. She put her hand on her belly, and smiled, thinking of the secret she carried there. One more thing I want to tell you. Bobby looked at her friend's hand and her face lit up. She leaned forward to whisper, Me too. Sarah laughed. If anyone would understand the significance of her touching her belly, it would be Bobby. No one knew her like Bobby. I'm so glad I have you back. She wrapped her arm around her friend and hugged her once more. Jacob and Karl found them like that a minute later. Karl shook his head. I think we're about to see a whole lot more of each other. Jacob nodded. That's a gut thing.